This is the multi-voice text-to-speech podfic reading of Save Me by WeasleyKitten01, composed by Burning Aurora, Kaliana, and Flowerhawk. Chapter 1, The Meeting. Sirius wiped his sweaty palms on the smooth fabric of his trousers as he tried to gather the courage to knock on the door in front of him. He'd already checked that he was at the correct address 3 times now. There was no point checking again. But the front door of the house he was standing at seemed far too ordinary for his usual clientele. Not that it mattered, necessarily. Perhaps it would make a nice change to be in a normal house for once, to not have to experience flashbacks to his upbringing throughout his time here. Sirius had been disinherited from the noble and most ancient house of Black the moment he'd come into his secondary gender and had presented as an Omega, a male Omega, in place of the heir to the house. His mother had spat the word at him and turned him out onto the streets the moment he'd shown signs that he was going into his very first heat. He'd managed to make it to James, his best friend at school, and thankfully his mother Euphemia, also an Omega, had been able to get Sirius into their house and locked up safely before James, a primed alpha, could do something that he'd regret. He'd lived with the Potters for many years following this, and when they'd gotten old enough to move out on their own, he and James had bought flats across the hall from each other in the same building in central London. Sirius spent most of his time with James anyway, but it was nice to have their own space when their cycles hit and they needed to have some privacy. Recently, James had also been seeing someone. He hadn't said anything, but Sirius knew. The way the man smiled at his phone, how settled he seemed after his ruts. It was obvious, really. Sirius was truly pleased for James, but he'd also known that this was a path that he wouldn't ever be able to tread for himself. He didn't want to settle down, didn't want to ever feel like he was always at the beck and call of one person. He'd felt that way the whole time that he'd lived under his mother's roof, and he'd made a vow to himself that it would never, ever happen again. So Sirius had spent the majority of his heats alone. He'd tried once or twice to use an alpha from an agency, but he'd hated feeling so vulnerable, so weak, and it had made him resolve to endure his heats without a partner as best he could. But toys and comfort items just weren't cutting it, and Sirius was starting to worry that he might have to find someone sooner or later, if just for convenience. He'd considered asking James, of course, but he couldn't. It would just make things unnecessarily complicated. And besides, he loved James in a way that he'd never loved anyone else. There was no way he would risk their bond over something as stupid as his dumb Omega needs. Instead, he decided to branch out. He'd looked a little further into becoming an Omega for hire, to help alphas through their ruts, and after looking around, he'd signed up to a high-end company working out of London. It wasn't for money, of course. His great-uncle, another Black family outcast, had left Sirius his rather significant fortune in his last will and testament, something Sirius only found out about when the man had passed away 4 years ago. No, it wasn't for financial security that Sirius had signed up to the agency, though the hefty pay packet he got after each visit didn't hurt. Ultimately, it scratched that need that Sirius always buried deep inside himself, that awful, aching desire to just be wanted. He sighed, frustrated by the memories that always cropped up at the worst moments, and made himself straighten, made himself lift his hand and knock on the door. He waited for it to be answered, and was just about to knock again when the door swung inwards. Sirius could only gape at the man standing in the doorway. Tall was an understatement. The man towered over Sirius, though he held his frame in a way that indicated he was trying very hard not to. He was slim, lithe but not skinny, and Sirius could see the evidence of toned muscles rippling under his tanned skin as he moved. A mess of bronzed curls fell in twists around his face and into his eyes. And by gods, those eyes. At first glance, they appeared to just be a warm brown, but as the man smiled and leaned forwards, his face came into the sunlight, and his irises turned almost pure amber. Sirius was still staring when the man spoke.
Sirius, right.
Well, that just was not fair. All of that beauty and a deep, rich voice like liquid honey, slightly melodic with the local Welsh accent running through it. It played over Sirius's skin, making goosebumps rise over his flesh, and he bit into his own tongue to repress a shudder.
Yes.
He finally croaked, then cleared his throat, ignoring the flush that was spreading up his cheeks. He made himself straighten and held out his right hand.
Sirius Black. I'm from the agency.
Excellent.
The man beamed, reaching out with one large hand, which entirely engulfed Sirius's. Sirius swallowed thickly as something sparked through him when their hands met, but he tamped whatever it was down as he suddenly became aware of the feeling of raised scars under his fingers. Indeed, now he looked more closely. He could see silvery lines crisscrossing all over the lanky body before him. He made himself look at the man's face again when he dropped Sirius's hand and stepped back.
I'm Remus. Won't you come in?
Thank you.
Sirius stooped to heft his overnight bag up and over his shoulder and strode purposefully past Remus and into the narrow hallway beyond the front door. As he passed, he took a surreptitious sniff and almost keeled over when the most mouth-watering scent flooded his nostrils. Oh, this man was an alpha, all right. Quite possibly the most delicious-smelling alpha that Sirius had ever met. Remus smelled like honeysuckle and embers, and was that chocolate? It took a lot of effort for Sirius to continue into the hall and not just turn and bury his face against Remus's neck.
Are you hungry or thirsty? I could make us something if you'd like.
The alpha asked as he shut the door, and Sirius could have sworn that the man's voice sounded a little strained. He turned, but Remus looked exactly as he had when Sirius had first seen him, so he dismissed the thought.
No, thank you. I ate earlier.
He didn't clarify that it had been 3 a.m. when he'd last eaten. Technically, he hadn't lied, but accepting food or drink from an unknown alpha was a risky business, in that it could suggest something he didn't want it to, and Sirius always waited until he'd been with them for around a day before he accepted such an offer.
All right, well, you let me know if you change your mind.
Remus smiled at him again, and Sirius's mouth twitched upwards of its own volition. The alpha seemed pleased by this, and there was a definite spring in his step as he approached. His voice was easy, light, as he went on.
I'm afraid my house isn't very big, but if you go down to the end of the hallway, there's a spare bedroom where you can store your things while you're here. I'll give you some time to get settled, and I'll wait for you in the living room.
He knocked on a door at his right, where he'd come to a stop to indicate the room he meant.
Okay, thank you.
Sirius hesitated. The man had introduced himself as Remus, but Sirius had learnt the hard way not to assume. Some alphas, particularly when they were in rut, didn't like to be called by their names. Some had specific requests. Some would only be called alpha. Remus, thankfully, came swiftly to his aid.
You can call me Remus.
He said casually, that soft smile tugging at his scarred lips again.
Is it all right for me to call you Sirius?
Sirius almost reeled at the question. He was feeling very wrong-footed by this whole interaction. This alpha, an alpha that was supposedly entering his rut, was treating Sirius with the utmost care and respect. Of course, he knew that alphas weren't all mindless beasts. James and Fleamont had shown him that. But he could smell a spicy undertone on this alpha, a sure sign that pheromones were flowing freely through his system. And yet he was showing such restraint, such care. It was making Sirius nervous.
Sirius is fine.
He confirmed. Remus nodded, then turned to open the door he'd knocked on moments before.
See you shortly then, Sirius.
Sirius tried to ignore how all of the nerve endings in his body lit up when Remus said his name, and made himself walk down the hallway in search of the room that would be his for the next few days. 20 minutes later, Sirius was knocking softly on the door of the living room where he and Remus had parted ways. He felt a little idiotic for the way he was announcing his presence, but he'd noticed an increase in the alpha's scent, had been able to detect it from the other end of the hallway, and he really didn't want to put himself at risk by sneaking up on an alpha who was probably in rut by now. So he waited for Remus to call,
Come in.
before he pushed the door open. Remus stood in front of a large stone fireplace that was set into the far wall of the room, a long and well-stuffed sofa positioned behind him, clearly positioned to maximize the benefits of the fire when it was lit. Even from here, Sirius thought that he could feel the heat from the flames, and he welcomed it after having padded through the somewhat cool hallway. Remus had his back to the door, and he didn't turn straight away when Sirius shut it behind him, so Sirius took a couple of seconds to cast his gaze around the room. It was large, but cozy. To his left, the entire wall was taken up by a built-in bookcase, absolutely stuffed with books of all shapes, sizes, colors, and conditions. In each corner of that end of the room, set out from the wall so that the books behind could be accessed, were 2 high wing-back chairs, upholstered with worn red leather. Sirius couldn't stop himself smiling at the immediate mental image of Remus cuddled up in one of the armchairs, book in hand and mug of tea on the small circular coffee table beside it. But then something dark twisted in his gut when he wondered who he usually chose to sit in the other chair, and he had to look away. To his right, the wall on the opposite end of the room was taken up almost entirely by a wide window. Sirius's breath caught slightly as he took in the view, and without conscious thought he gravitated towards the window. He'd not really paid it much attention, had just clambered out of the taxi that had brought him out here from the local train station, and walked straight up to the door. From here, however, he could see that Remus's house sat at the top of a small hill and overlooked the misty, frost-bitten valley below. From here, Sirius could see the narrow road he must have taken to get here, and could see that there was hardly any traffic flowing along it.
It must seem so quiet out here.
Remus commented softly, and Sirius spun to find the Alpha watching him, a strangely fond expression on his handsome face. Remus's smile turned sheepish as he clarified.
Compared to London, I mean. I know that my house may seem humble, but the view makes it entirely worth it.
I love it.
Sirius blurted, then blushed and looked down at his feet. It was true. He had already fallen hard for the old dark wooden flooring, the warm, quaint, soft furnishings, how this house was so obviously someone's home. He looked out of the window again and murmured,
I grew up in a house that was more like a museum than a home. We weren't allowed to touch or move anything, and it was very dark and miserable.
He glanced at Remus, who was watching him intently, and something about that attention made him go on.
It's nice to be somewhere that is obviously lived in and cared for.
What about where you live now?
Remus asked carefully, and there was a slightly breathless quality to his words that Sirius immediately craved. He blinked when he realized that the Alpha had moved, and was much closer now. But then Remus was talking again, and Sirius's mind narrowed on his lovely voice.
What's your current home like, Sirius?
It's okay.
He breathed, his mouth going quite dry as Remus continued to prowl towards him.
Not as comfortable as this, it's functional. Close to what I need.
Remus mused, his eyes traveling over Sirius's body.
Do you feel safe there?
Absolutely.
Sirius was surprised by how firm he sounded, and he realized that yes, he did feel safe there. He'd never felt safe at Grimmauld Place, for obvious reasons. And although the Potters had done everything they could to make him feel included, he'd always had a background fear that his family would come and take him away, and that he would be forced to give it up. So he'd never really felt safe there, either. But the flat was his. He'd bought it, and James was right there, and nobody could take that away. He smiled at Remus as he said,
I feel very safe there.
That's good.
Remus murmured, and Sirius swayed slightly as the man stepped right in close. He was forced to tilt his head back so that he could look up into the Alpha's eyes, and Remus straightened, pride flicking across his face at Sirius's reaction to his proximity. But then he was focused again, his voice gentle as he said,
I want you to feel safe here too, Sirius. I need you to know that if things get too much, you have the safety of the spare bedroom to retreat to.
Sirius's disbelief must have shown on his face as Remus chuckled and added,
I know that probably sounds rather trite, considering that I'm an alpha who's currently filled with rut hormones. But things are, slightly different for me. I have a condition that makes my control over my instincts a little easier.
A condition.
Sirius asked, his mind a little vague as he tried to take in what the man was saying without getting distracted by his all-consuming scent. But Remus's face twisted a little, breaking their eye contact to look out of the window over Sirius's shoulder, and Sirius felt panic rise in him, panic that was tinged with an Omega's response to an Alpha.
No, don't do that. Don't hide from me.
He was brought back sharply by that thought, momentarily confused by it. What was that supposed to mean?
It's hard to explain.
Remus muttered bitterly, meeting Sirius's gaze again. There was a wall behind those amber eyes, something built from years of hurt and hardship. Sirius would recognize that wall anywhere. He'd seen it every day in the mirror, behind his own eyes. He wanted to push against it, but he knew that it would be useless. Remus had decided that this was something that he wouldn't share with Sirius, and it would be incredibly hypocritical of him not to respect that. Remus's eyes softened again when he went on.
It's part of the reason I've sought help through an agency for this rut, rather than trying to find my own partner.
You've had a partner before.
Sirius asked, pretending that he didn't notice how the idea of Remus with someone else made his blood boil.
Get it together, Black. You're here to do a job for fuck's sake.
Once or twice,
Remus conceded with a shrug.
but nothing ever seems to last.
I know that feeling.
Sirius offered, trying to sound casual. Remus gave him an unreadable look and opened his mouth to say something more. But then a wave of his scent barreled into Sirius, the spicy edge to it now almost overwhelming, and Sirius's mouth fucking watered. A whimper crept unbidden up his throat, and Remus's pupils dilated rapidly at the sound. The alpha rumbled, deep in his chest, and he dipped his head slowly, aiming for Sirius's neck. The pace he was going made it clear that if Sirius said no, Remus would respect this and back away. And something about the impressive level of self-control that the alpha was demonstrating made Sirius want to submit all the more. Sirius tilted his head, simultaneously giving consent and better access, and his knees almost buckled when Remus's nose came into contact with his throat. Remus breathed in deeply, but then he jolted backwards, as though someone had gripped his hair and roughly tugged his head back. The alpha's scent diminished, like a strong wind was whipping it away, and Sirius blinked, his head clearing as Remus frowned down at him and murmured,
That's weird.
Is everything all right?
Sirius asked, his hand raising uncertainly, as though he might comfort the man somehow. Remus breathed in slowly again, then tilted his head to one side, the movement strangely canine. Those molten amber eyes trailed over Sirius's body again, and Sirius felt himself responding favorably to the man's attention. But he held himself still, once more conscious of making any sudden movements. He frowned, confused when Remus sighed.
Yes, I don't know if I've miscalculated, but it appears that my rut hasn't quite started yet. Or rather, something seems to be delaying it.
Oh, is that?
Sirius cut himself off before he could say something stupid or offensive, but Remus smirked as though he'd heard the words anyway. Sirius wished he wouldn't smile like that. It made the dimple in his right cheek deepen, made Sirius want to lick the alpha's skin right there, made him want to find out what that smile felt and tasted like against his own lips. He mentally shook himself as Remus spoke again.
It's unusual for it to happen, but there are a couple of things known to cause it.
Such as?
He couldn't help himself. He'd always been curious. To a fault, his mother had liked to tell him. He bit his lower lip to stifle any further inappropriate questions, and almost gasped when Remus's gaze dropped and locked onto Sirius's mouth.
I'm sure it's nothing to worry about.
Remus rasped, his eyes growing dark again as he stared down at Sirius.
But it's strange. My rut hasn't started, but I still...
Remus swallowed hard, and Sirius felt his own eyes widen as he gathered the alpha's meaning.
Oh, right, well...
It took Sirius all of 2 seconds to make his decision. Yes, all right, he'd been hired to help this alpha through a rut, but fuck, was this man attractive? And rut or no, Sirius wanted him, so he straightened and gave Remus his most winning grin.
I'm here for a reason, aren't I?
That you are.
Remus murmured, his gaze focused on Sirius's mouth again.
I'd really like to kiss you, may I?
Be my guest.
Sirius breathed, then whimpered when Remus surged forwards and crushed their mouths together. Remus's hands were in his hair, pulling it slightly and using it to tilt Sirius's head to angle him into the kiss. And gods, did that feel good. Sirius stretched up onto his toes so that he could plaster his body against Remus's, and the taller man groaned, one of his hands dropping to cup Sirius's arse. He squeezed, and Sirius gasped, his head falling back as he felt the evidence of Remus's arousal against his hip.
Can I take you to my bedroom?
Remus breathed, and Sirius nodded, his tongue too tied to speak. Remus immediately stooped and slid his hands down the backs of Sirius's thighs, his fingers digging in as he pulled upwards. Sirius went with him, jumping and parting his legs so that he could wind them around the alpha's narrow waist. Remus hummed his approval as he dipped his head and nipped at Sirius's throat. Then he was moving, carrying Sirius back out into the hallway and across to another door, one that Sirius hadn't seen behind yet. He didn't really take the room in anyway. His eyes were closed as Remus's lips and teeth attacked his skin, and his mind swum with the lust that was coursing through him. He was so lost to it that he almost staggered when Remus eased him to his feet once more. But the man was there, holding Sirius's elbows, and Sirius felt so protected, so cared for. It was overwhelming. He wasn't used to such blatant affection, not even from James. His chest began to tighten.
What is it?
Remus asked quietly, his brow furrowed as he ducked his head to look into Sirius's eyes.
You smell scared. What?
Remus's eyes went wide, and he moved as though he might step away.
We can stop.
No.
Sirius wrapped his hands in the man's jumper and pulled, tugging him closer again. The tension in his body disappeared the moment his body was pressed to Remus's once more, and the alpha's nostrils flared, the concern leaving his eyes as he scented the change in Sirius's emotions. Sirius swallowed and made himself say,
Sorry, it's been a while for me. Outside of, the agency stuff.
Remus nodded, but his teeth were gritted and his voice was tight as he ground out.
I'm not casting judgment on your profession, but please could you not mention it while we're like this? I can only control my instincts so far.
Sirius felt his own eyes widen as he grasped the Alpha's meaning. He didn't want to hear about Sirius being with others, not while they were doing whatever it was that they were doing right now. He could understand that, remembered the flavor of jealousy from that fleeting moment in Remus's living room. So he nodded and pushed himself up onto his tiptoes so that he could press a firm kiss to Remus's lips. The Alpha groaned into the kiss, his big hands skating up Sirius's back, pulling the material of his shirt up with the movement. Sirius sighed as his body began to heat under the taller man's touches, but it wasn't enough. He wanted more, wanted to feel as much of this Alpha against him as he could get. So he gripped Remus's jumper tighter and used it to spin them around towards where he thought he'd seen the bed. The motion set Remus off balance, and Sirius used this to his advantage to push him back. Remus staggered and fell, bouncing on the mattress. His eyes practically glowed as he gazed up at Sirius, a warning growl creeping out of him, but Sirius just gave him a cocky grin that he knew would have the Alpha seeing red. He quickly climbed onto the bed and straddled Remus, his knees digging into the mattress on either side of the Alpha's hips. When he was comfortably positioned, Sirius reached down and tugged his own shirt up, slowly lifting it up his body to reveal inch after inch of creamy toned torso, dotted with the black ink of tattoos. Remus's eyes locked onto Sirius's abdomen, the rumbling in his chest deepening, and when Sirius had tugged the top over his head and tossed it behind him, the Alpha's hands rose, seemingly subconsciously, towards the bare skin before him. But Sirius wasn't ready to give up control entirely just yet, so he grabbed Remus's wrists, directing the man's scarred hands to his hips as he bent forwards at the waist. He licked at Remus's neck, delighting in the moan it pulled from him, then moved to press their lips together again. Remus's taste filled his mouth, his senses, but Sirius kissed him lightly, sweeping his tongue along sharp teeth and nipping gently at his lower lip. Before he could blink, Remus had grabbed his hips and flipped them. Sirius hit the mattress with a yelp, which turned into a deep groan as Remus followed him down, nestling his hips between Sirius's thighs and wrapping strong fingers around his slender wrists.
Don't tease, Omega.
Remus growled, flashing his teeth in a way that had Sirius whining softly and wriggling below him, seeking friction. Remus pressed his own hips down hard as he yanked Sirius's hands up and over his head, transferring both into one hand and pinning them there. He leaned over Sirius and purred against his throat.
Now be a good boy and hold still.
Sirius immediately obeyed, his trousers becoming uncomfortably tight. He watched as Remus sat back, his long fingers tracing patterns over Sirius's torso, making him shiver at the feather-light touches. His mouth went dry as he watched Remus mimic Sirius's action from moments ago, slowly tugging his jumper up and over his head. It took considerable effort for Sirius to not reach out, to not let his itching fingers trace every one of the scars that littered the man's torso. He became aware that Remus was watching him, waiting for his reaction, so he looked up and locked eyes with the Alpha. Whatever Remus saw in Sirius's face made him relax, his shoulders loosening, and he made quick work of removing his trousers and boxers, somehow managing to seem graceful as he did this while balancing on the mattress. Sirius's eyes went straight to Remus's considerable prick, long and thick and oh so very hard. He'd never been worried by an Alpha's cock before, knew that as an Omega, he was built to take it. But the sheer size of Remus, Sirius swallowed and tried not to imagine how much bigger the man was going to feel when he was knotting him. Then Remus was tearing at the remaining items of Sirius's clothing, mapping out each newly exposed area of pale skin with his scarred palms and drinking in the sight of the soon naked body below him. Sirius could feel his blood singing, heating in response to the impossibly gentle caresses, the evident need in the Alpha's gaze. No, that wasn't need, he realized with a slight shiver of anticipation. That was hunger. Remus's hands continued to move over Sirius's abdomen, brushing against his tattoos, his nipples, his toned stomach. The Alpha shifted his hips occasionally, causing their leaking shafts to brush against each other briefly, but he held his position enough that Sirius couldn't get the friction he needed, not without outright bucking up off the bed. Before long, Sirius was whimpering and writhing desperately, the head of his iron-hard cock wet with pre-cum, his whole body tingling and desperate. His member pulsed almost painfully when he looked up and found Remus watching him with near-feral desire, his sharp canines glinting in the light that streamed in through the windows. The rapt focus in the man's expression made him lose that last fragment of his control, and Sirius heard himself whine.
Alpha, please.
Please what, love?
Remus murmured, and fuck, that endearment made Sirius's need impossible to ignore.
Please take me, I need you. Alpha, I'm yours, please fuck me.
If he'd been more conscious, Sirius probably would have cringed at the way he was begging this man. But there was something about Remus, something that had been calling Sirius's Omega instincts closer to the surface than he ever allowed them to get, and the lines he usually maintained very well during these encounters were blurring rapidly.
Such lovely manners.
Remus crooned, leaning forward and sinking his teeth into the soft spot between Sirius's neck and shoulder, just below his pulsing mating gland. Sirius fought to hold back his bark of pained pleasure, but found it harder still when Remus flattened his tongue over the tender flesh to soothe the hurt. He could hear himself panting as the scent of Remus's arousal swirled round him, making his head spin.
Please.
He was too far gone for banter now. He just needed.
I've got you.
Sirius gasped as he felt a finger slide against his embarrassingly slick entrance, and Remus's face abruptly swam into view. He was biting his lip and watching Sirius with that focus again as he worked his fingertip in circles, then gently pressed forward. The digit slid in easily, and Remus swore softly as he withdrew, then added another.
You feel so good, Sirius. So tight and hot. Oh, fuck, you're just perfect.
Sirius gasped as a third finger slid inside next to the others, and Remus set up a slow, teasing rhythm. He stretched Sirius's hole in a way that was so familiar and yet somehow managed to feel so new. Sirius almost lost it when Remus's fingers curled right there inside him, but he managed to stop himself. Over his years as a hired Omega, he had learnt to hold himself back, to wait for the command. Instead, he let his eyes roll with each thrust and felt his pre-cum dripping down onto his stomach, but he refused to follow the insistent press of his building orgasm. He wanted to touch himself, to touch Remus, but his hands were still above his head, pinned by Remus's words alone.
Are you ready for me?
Remus's voice was thick with want, and Sirius forced himself to meet his gaze again. The fire burning in those eyes almost ruined his resolve, but he bit into his own lip hard enough to center himself. Unable to speak, he simply nodded. It was enough. Remus shifted so that he was settled further between Sirius's legs, his hand finding Sirius's wrists again, and he nudged the Omega's inner thighs with his knees to encourage him to spread them wider. Sirius obeyed and kept his eyes fixed on Remus as he reached between them and lined himself up. When he felt Remus's tip against his entrance, Sirius bit down so hard on the lip between his teeth that he tasted his own blood, and Remus's head instantly snapped up. His nostrils flared, and Sirius realized that this close to his rut, with his senses so heightened, Remus must be able to smell the blood. The Alpha leaned forwards and kissed Sirius, sucking the split lower lip into his mouth and smoothing his tongue against the already healing cut. As their mouths melded together again, Remus pushed all the way in, pulling a ragged gasp from Sirius. Remus took the opportunity to slip his tongue in between his teeth, flicking it briefly against Sirius's before pulling back to brace his free forearm beside the Omega's head. Remus's eyes shone as he took in the expression on Sirius's face. Sirius was once more overwhelmed with the need to touch the Alpha above him as the man murmured.
Gods, you're such a gorgeous little thing, aren't you?
Alpha.
Sirius whimpered, pushing his wrists up against the strong fingers clasped around them. Suddenly he was released, and he immediately wound his hands into those thick brown curls as Remus's head dropped to his neck, sucking and licking and nipping at the soft flesh there as his thrusts became faster, harder. But Sirius wanted more. He wanted Remus to lose himself in his body, to take what he needed and give everything he had. So Sirius did what he hoped would snap that careful control. He reached behind Remus with one hand and raked his short nails up the Alpha's scarred back. He was rewarded almost instantly with a deep snarl that reverberated all the way to his bones. Remus pulled out of Sirius and deftly flipped him over, pulling his hips up so that he was on his knees with his chest pressed to the bed. Sirius looked over his shoulder just in time to watch Remus hungrily eyeing his hole before guiding himself back in and thrusting hard. He set up a punishing pace, slamming against Sirius with a force that made it difficult to stay upright. But this problem was soon resolved, as Remus reached beneath him and grasped the Omega's aching length. The whine that left Sirius's throat was strangled, and with each gasping outbreath his whimpering became less and less human.
That's it, love.
Remus growled from somewhere above him, and Sirius could hear him fighting against the alpha drive to take over completely.
That's it. Take it all. Such a good boy for me. You're so pretty like this, with me filling you, desperate for release. Do you want to come for me?
Sirius was beyond words, so he locked eyes with Remus over his shoulder and nodded frantically. Remus's laugh huffed hot breath against his skin, and Sirius felt at real risk of becoming overstimulated by the sensations and scents surrounding him. Remus was pounding into him so fast that he was panting as he continued to rasp out his stream of filthy words.
I want you to come for me, Omega, but only when I say, fuck, you're so tight and so hard, I could easily get addicted to feeling what I do to you. Do you feel what you do to me, Sirius? Do you feel how deep I am inside you? How much I need you? Fuck, I'm going to. Come, Omega, come for me. Fuck, Sirius.
The noise Remus made as he spilled inside of Sirius was intoxicating, and Sirius's eyes rolled into his head once more as he thrust into Remus's fist, shooting ropes of his own release across the bedspread beneath him and up his own torso. Sirius cried out as Remus's shaft began to grow inside him, and he came again when he realized that the alpha's knot was growing, locking inside him. He tried to keep still, but couldn't resist rocking forwards, to pull that firm bulge against his rim, to feel the stretch. Remus snarled at the sensation and pitched forward, sinking his teeth into the back of Sirius's neck and stilling him effectively as his cock continued to pulse against Sirius's walls. Tears filled Sirius's eyes as contentment flowed through him. His alpha had nodded him. He'd been such a good boy, such a good Omega. His alpha was filling him with his seed. He must have been very good. But his knees were shaking from overstimulation and trying to hold up Remus's weight, and he tried to speak, to tell his alpha that he needed to move. All that escaped him was a broken grunt, but luckily, Remus appeared to understand him anyway.
Sorry, love, hold on.
The alpha's voice was so deep and raspy, and goosebumps prickled all over Sirius's skin at the sound. But then he gasped in pain when Remus shifted, his knot pulling at Sirius's sensitive rim. Remus cooed.
And how I'm sorry, I've got you.
As he carefully eased them both onto their sides, and after a little more shuffling, Sirius was laid down, with Remus's warm, comforting weight molded to his back. He hummed happily when Remus's fingers tangled into his hair, and the alpha kissed apologetically at the bite mark on the back of his neck. Sirius was drifting, sleep claiming him rapidly, and he almost missed it when Remus murmured,
I think I'm in trouble with you, Sirius Black.
Chapter 2, The Meaning. Sirius groaned as he felt the mattress shift behind him, and his eyes fluttered open. The light in the room was now a soft orange, and he realized that he must have been asleep for a few hours. He also realized that he'd slept better than he had in, well, as long as he could remember, really. He was just trying to get his bearings when something shifted against his back, and he sucked a hissing breath in through his teeth when he felt a dull ache at his entrance. He scrabbled for a grip on the duvet over him, trying not to move as the alpha began to pull out of him. He nearly jumped when a large, soft hand stroked lightly over his stomach.
Easy,
Remus murmured in his ear. His voice was thick and gravelly with sleep, and the sound sent a jolt of electricity through Sirius's tired body. Remus moved again, and Sirius couldn't quite catch the groan that rose in his chest at the pulling at his hole. Remus placed gentle kisses across his shoulder, murmuring praises and apologies as he eased all the way out of Sirius. When they were no longer connected, Remus kissed his neck and whispered,
better.
Sirius hummed and felt Remus smile against his skin. Then the alpha was rolling away, and in his sensitized haze, Sirius couldn't stop himself from gripping the arm Remus still had wrapped around his waist. Remus chuckled.
I'll be right back, okay?
Sirius huffed and reluctantly released Remus's arm with a sigh, and felt instantly cold when the alpha's hot torso moved away from his back. He must have dozed off again, because the next thing he knew, a warm and wet cloth was pressing against his arse. Sirius whined softly at the pressure on his sensitive skin, but Remus's voice quickly met his ears.
Sorry, need to get you cleaned up.
Sirius turned his head to stare up at the alpha, and was surprised to see that fondness again in the way the taller man was looking down at him. His gaze became locked on those fiery amber eyes, then on Remus's mouth as he smiled. Sirius saw the glint of slightly elongated canines, and the knowledge that he'd probably been marked by those teeth sent lust pooling through him. It shifted into something else when Remus's hand came up to brush Sirius's hair out of his face, and the gesture was almost affectionate.
Thank you.
Sirius breathed, though he wasn't really sure what for.
You're welcome.
Remus replied as he straightened up from leaning over the bed.
Why don't you take your time getting up? Come back to the living room when you're ready, and we'll have something to eat, okay?
Okay.
Sirius said, a little unsure. He had been prepared to just be used over and over by the Alpha to see him through his rut, as usually happened. Some Alphas in the past hadn't even offered Sirius food during the whole rut period, a lesson Sirius had learnt the hard way. He'd since packed dried foods into his bag every time he went to stay with an Alpha, especially if he'd been with them before and knew that they forgot to cater for his needs during their rut. But here was Remus, caring and catering for him, again, and he definitely was not prepared for that.
All right then,
Remus said, and with one last lovely smile he left the room. Sirius tried to ignore the pull he felt in his chest to follow the man, and instead rolled gingerly onto his back. He was a little sore, but it was nothing compared to other sessions he'd endured. He didn't want to think about all of the other ways that what they'd done was different to other sessions. Getting close to those thoughts felt like pressing too hard on a bruise, so he stayed away. To distract himself, he looked around the room. It was simply furnished with a dark wooden bed frame and wardrobe, and Sirius could see 2 doors set into the walls. Remus had just exited through one of them, and the other was slightly ajar. Through it, he could see white tile, and he slowly eased himself up from the huge, comfortable mattress and made his way into the bathroom. It would be the least he could do to clean himself up a bit, considering how nice Remus was being to him. He used the toilet quickly and washed his face and torso with the soap by the sink before making his way back into the bedroom. He found a pair of joggers and a jumper waiting on the edge of the bed for him. He picked them up carefully, and the movement of the articles released their scent. Honeysuckle, embers, definitely chocolate. Sirius buried his face in the jumper and inhaled deeply. Fuck, this Alpha's scent was quickly becoming addictive. He dressed hurriedly, a sudden need to be near the man again spurring him on, and with bare feet he padded through the one-story house, making his way back to the living room. The door to the room was open slightly, and Sirius could hear Remus's voice rumbling from inside. He paused outside the door and quickly realized that Remus was talking to someone on the phone. Sirius was about to back away, to give him some privacy, when Remus's next words made him freeze in his tracks.
So you see, unfortunately, the contract has to be voided.
Sirius's stomach dropped when he recognized the voice of one of the agency admin staff, tinny as it came through the loudspeaker of Remus's mobile. He couldn't quite hear what they were saying, but Remus kept talking.
Yes, thank you for understanding. No, I'm happy to tell him. It might be best coming from me anyway. Yes, all right, thank you again for your help.
Sirius's blood rushed in his ears, and he couldn't have moved if he wanted to. He felt lightheaded at the idea that Remus was dissatisfied with him, and tried to rack his memory for what he could have possibly done that would displease the Alpha. He couldn't immediately pinpoint anything, and the thought that it was simply him that Remus hadn't liked made something crack in his chest. Perhaps that's why his rut had been delayed. He just didn't want Sirius. A little voice in the back of his mind tried to deny this, tried to show him images of how Remus had looked at him when Sirius had kissed him, tried to remind him of the longing he thought he'd felt in the way that the man's hands skated over his skin. But Sirius was so used to disappointment, so used to being a disappointment, that it was too easy for him to smother that reasonable voice and its arguments. No, it was for the best. There was no way that someone like Remus would want someone like him hanging around anyway. He'd known Remus for less than a day, but he already knew that the man was smart, kind, thoughtful. Sirius was emotionless, cruel at times, thoughtless even. Remus deserved a better Omega to see him through his rut. He might as well go and get ready to leave. He was trying to force himself to do this when the door in front of him swung wide, and he came face to face with Remus.
I thought I heard someone out here,
The taller man said, the corner of his mouth twitching slightly, and oh, it was so very unfair how attractive this Alpha was, even more so when Sirius was about to be sent away, never to see him again. But then Remus stepped back and said,
Won't you come in?
He should have said no, should have thanked Remus for his hospitality and gone to gather his things. Instead, He found himself walking into the room on shaky legs. The fire was still dancing in the grate, and the room remained almost unchanged from when he'd seen it earlier in the day. The only difference was the low coffee table, which was now laden with a huge platter of sandwiches, a large jug of fresh juice, and a tea set with steam curling out of the spout of the teapot. He stood uncertainly before the fire for a moment, then Remus joined him and indicated the sofa, gesturing silently for him to sit. Sirius sank down gratefully and clasped his trembling hands tight in his lap, trying to take shallow breaths. If he was to be sent away, he needed to not get too wrapped up in that smell. It didn't help that Remus's scent was already wrapped around him from the clothes, but it also rolled off the alpha in waves as he sat down next to Sirius.
Are you hungry?
Remus asked him softly. Sirius almost denied that he was, but before he could answer, his stomach rumbled. Remus instantly set to work filling a plate with sandwiches, and Sirius blinked when the man turned and handed it to him. Despite the upcoming disappointment, it would have been rude to outright refuse an alpha's offering of food in this manner, so Sirius bowed his head and took the plate. Remus seemed pleased by this, a small smile gracing his scarred lips as he piled a plate for himself, then poured them both tea. Sirius ate and drank silently, trying to ignore how his stomach roiled whenever he thought about what was to come. But he really was hungry from their earlier activities, so he cleaned his plate and drained 2 full glasses of juice in quick succession. He could feel Remus's eyes on him, and the tension in the room built steadily throughout the meal, to the point where Sirius jolted slightly when Remus finally set down his plate.
Sirius,
Remus said, and Sirius desperately wanted to look at him, but he didn't dare. He knew that it would make his dismissal so much worse. When he didn't move, Remus leaned closer and murmured,
Look at me.
His alpha tone was carefully woven through the words, the first time he'd used it, and Sirius's head rose instinctively. His eyes met Remus's, and he felt that strange tug behind his ribs again as their gazes met. He could have sworn that Remus's breath hitched slightly before he asked,
How much of my conversation with your agency did you hear?
I heard enough.
Sirius croaked, then cleared his throat.
I'm sorry that I've disappointed you, especially when you were expecting your rut, and I completely understand that you need to have me replaced as soon as possible to help you through it. I just wanted to thank you for choosing me, and for the meal. I can go and get my bag now. It'll only take me a moment to get changed and I can be on my way.
Sirius.
Remus's voice was impossibly gentle, and Sirius's chest ached so badly that he had to close his eyes momentarily to handle the pain of it. What was happening to him? When he looked at Remus again, the alpha was looking at him sadly.
You haven't disappointed me.
Then why?
Why did I say that the contract has to be voided?
Sirius nodded, and Remus breathed out harshly, raising one hand to scrub his long fingers through his lovely curls. The motion made his bicep muscles stand out, and Sirius's mouth went dry at the sight. Remus braced his forearms on his knees as he met Sirius's gaze again, then said,
I may have figured out why my rut is being delayed. It's going to sound strange, but I need you to trust that I will explain everything. Do you want to know?
Sirius, very confused, simply nodded, unable to look away from Remus's face. He was surprised by the slight flicker of fear that crossed the man's expression, and panic rose in him. What could be so bad that an alpha was this afraid of it? Remus sighed again and clenched and unclenched his jaw before he went on.
How much do you know about mating?
Remus asked quietly.
Mating?
Sirius parroted, truly baffled now. Where was this going? He searched his mind, sifting through lessons and lectures his mother had given to him and his brother over the years.
I know that when an alpha finds someone they want to be theirs, they become obsessed with them and find it hard to leave them unprotected, even if the other is stronger or more skilled than they are. That's why they place the claiming bite, to announce their property.
Remus gave Sirius a strange look, then said slowly,
Well, yes, I suppose that is an element of it, but it's not just about the alpha. It's also about their partner, about a bond of love. An alpha can claim anyone they choose, but to find your true mate means that you've essentially found the other part of your soul, someone who complements you so perfectly that there can never be anyone else for you. The claiming bite is also the alpha's way of announcing their promise to take care of their mate.
Remus swallowed, then looked at his hands.
Of course, the bond can be rejected, and when that happens, it's rather painful for both parties, but...
Wait,
Sirius murmured, his mind slowly catching up.
what does this have to do with your rut?
Well,
Remus said, shifting uncomfortably on the sofa and not really looking at Sirius.
Well, one of the reasons why a rut might be delayed is if the alpha finds their mate and their cycles aren't aligned yet.
Remus glanced at Sirius, and something inside Sirius stilled. Surely he wasn't suggesting.
There are a couple of other possibilities, of course, but after we were intimate earlier, I've been getting this strange pulling right here.
Remus raised his hand to his own sternum, exactly where Sirius had felt that insistent tugging in his own chest before.
And I remember reading about something similar in a book on mating once.
Remus trailed off, and Sirius stared, and stared, and stared. His mind was whirling, and his face was frozen. He could see how the jigsaw should fit together, but the final piece refused to fall into place. When he didn't say anything, Remus shifted closer, his brow creased in concern.
Tell me what you're thinking, please.
The alpha's tone was worried, and the sound of it released Sirius's tongue. How? Sirius shook his head helplessly, and Remus took pity on him.
Nobody is really sure how it happens,
He said carefully.
Mostly, people find their mates by accident. But as I said, the bond can be broken if it's not something that both parties want.
I don't.
Sirius swallowed, his chest tightening rapidly, his pulse pounding in his own ears. He couldn't catch a breath, couldn't quite get enough air. He was wheezing when he tried again.
I don't understand. I don't know. What do you want from me?
Nothing.
Remus looked genuinely shocked, pulling back from Sirius sharply.
I don't want anything from you, Sirius, but I thought you deserved to know.
Sirius was on his feet before he knew that he'd moved. Remus blanched and reached for him as though he might take Sirius's hand, and that was just too much. It was all too much. This cozy, welcoming room, this lovely, lived-in house, this warm, wonderful man. Too much. Too much to take. Too much that could be broken by his tainted hands. Sirius fled. He ran from the room and hurtled down the narrow hallway, ignoring Remus's shout of his name as it followed him through the house. He flung the front door open and raced out into the night, his bare feet almost sliding on the damp grass of Remus's lawn. He headed for the valley, for a patch of trees he'd spotted from the window earlier. His chest stung from the frosty air as he sucked in great lungfuls of oxygen, trying to get in as much of it as he could. He made it about 50 feet before he realized what he was doing, and his sprint turned into a jog, then a walk, and finally he stopped. His breath fogged the air in front of him as he panted, but soon that slowed too. His mind was the last thing to wind down, and as it did, he started to process what Remus had been trying to tell him. Remus had just been explaining what was happening to them, and at the first hint of something new, uncertain, Sirius had turned tail and run. He cursed himself bitterly. Stupid, foolish, black move. The man had outright told him that he could reject the bond if he chose to. He hadn't been pressuring him, hadn't been trying to trick him or trap him. He recalled the look on Remus's face, the outright honesty of his expression, and a lump rose in his throat. That something stirred in his chest again, and he lifted one hand and pressed down, right against his sternum. The thing pulled, twisting and tugging, and Sirius understood. He understood that the mating bond wasn't something that Remus was trying to push on him. It was in their nature. Somehow they had found their mates in each other, and though the pulling was pronounced, it didn't hurt. It ached, perhaps, like an old wound might, but when Sirius made himself turn back in the direction he'd come towards Remus's home, the ache reduced significantly. He gave himself a few more minutes to calm down, and as he stood in the cold, wet grass, his toes going more numb by the second, the thick clouds shifted and revealed a bright, full moon. Sirius tipped his head back and let the light of it dance over his skin, staring up at the glowing orb as if it might hold answers to the multitude of questions racing through his head. The moon, as always, stayed silent. But Sirius knew who would have the answers to those questions, if he were brave enough to ask. He began the walk back towards the little stone cottage at the top of the hill. He'd left the door wide open, and he hurried the last few feet to get back inside and close it before he let the chill run through the whole house. He paused in the hallway to gather himself, to gather his courage. He'd spent a long time building that courage, had spent years fighting his mother's lingering remarks and actions in order to foster it. He was proud of that courage. He was going to need every drop of it now. When he could feel his feet again, Sirius padded silently back down the hall and into the living room. He lingered in the doorway when he caught sight of Remus, still on the sofa, his head bowed and his forearms braced on his knees once more. He hadn't moved, hadn't tried to follow Sirius or chase him down. that restraint and respect for Sirius's choices. It made Sirius feel even worse for having run away in the first place. Sirius carefully crossed the room, and only when he was in front of Remus did the alpha raise his head. The noise Remus made when Sirius stopped before him was that of a wounded animal. He was staring up at the shorter man, as though he couldn't quite believe Sirius was there. Guilt crashed through him, along with a need to comfort, to soothe, and without thinking, Sirius stepped forward between the alpha's knees and wrapped his arms around the man's shoulders. Remus whimpered and pitched forward, his long arms winding around Sirius's waist as he buried his face into the Omega's chest.
I'm sorry.
Sirius murmured into thick bronzed curls.
I'm sorry, it was just all a bit too much too quickly, I'm sorry.
I understand.
Remus breathed, but Sirius could still hear the edge of pain to his voice. Sirius held him tighter and waited until Remus's breathing was less ragged, until the ache in his own chest had subsided enough that he could bear to not be touching the man. Only then did he carefully extract himself from the alpha's arms and sat down on the sofa next to him, gazing into amber eyes wet with unshed tears. Remus sounded uncertain when he said,
You came back.
I did.
Sirius murmured, his hand coming up to rest against the alpha's scarred cheek. Remus closed his eyes and leaned into the touch, and something in Sirius's chest burst into flames. He waited until Remus had opened his eyes again before he asked his first question.
You really think that we're mates?
If what I remember of my studies about our biologies are correct, then there are many signs that are pointing that way.
Remus sounded so sure that Sirius didn't doubt for a second that he was remembering correctly. He let out a slow breath and lowered his hand from Remus's cheek, twisting his fingers in his lap as he tried to organize his thoughts.
So what do we do about it?
Remus cocked his head on one side, puzzled, so Sirius clarified.
How do we go about being mates? Do we live together now? Do we need to get married?
Remus choked.
Married?
Well, I don't know.
Sirius sighed, throwing his hands up in exasperation.
All I've known my whole life is that finding your mate is uncommon, and that if you do, then that's that. Deal sealed.
I see.
Remus's voice was somewhat tight, his face a little pinched, and Sirius didn't like that, not one little bit.
Do you still have contact with your family, Sirius?
No.
Sirius frowned, thrown by the question.
Why?
Probably for the better.
Remus ground out. Sirius raised an eyebrow pointedly, and Remus sighed, made himself relax as he went on.
It sounds like you've been fed quite a lot of misinformation. I don't know for what purpose, but I don't think I'd like the answer if I found out anyway. So it's a good thing that you don't speak with your family, because I'd have a few choice words for them if I ever did meet them.
Sirius looked Remus up and down slowly, suddenly impressed. Granted, the man might not know exactly which family Sirius came from, and just how batshit crazy the lot of them were, but regardless, he was willing to stand against them, to tell them that they were wrong. James had always been vehemently against Sirius's family because of their emotional tie. Remus was against them on principle. It had a whole new flavor to it, a flavor that Sirius liked.
Educate me then,
he prompted, nudging Remus with his shoulder when he noticed that the man had disappeared into himself, brooding. Oh, this was getting better by the second. After a moment, Remus shook his head as though to clear it, and when he looked at Sirius again, it was with consideration.
Well,
Remus said, his forehead crinkling as he seemed to think. Sirius barely resisted the urge to reach up and smooth those creases with his thumb.
if I remember rightly, we're probably going to feel drawn to each other until the mating bond is either satisfied or broken.
And how do we satisfy it?
Sirius pressed, not quite ready to explore the alternative yet. Remus flushed, and Sirius just caught the way the alpha's eyes flicked down to his throat before they were locked with his once more. Remus swallowed audibly, then breathed.
I would have to bite and break your gland during your heat. That would confirm that you're mine, and the gland would heal, but it would hold the scar from my teeth.
Oh,
Sirius said quietly, somewhat less sure of himself now. That sounded painful and messy, and really rather permanent.
But that's something that I would only do with your permission.
Remus assured him hurriedly.
And it's definitely not something that we would have to rush into. We could take our time, figure out if this is what we really want.
all right.
Sirius said slowly.
And what would you propose we do in the meantime, while we're waiting to figure it out?
If you can tolerate the pull of the bond, then we could.
Remus paused, then took a deep breath and garbled.
We could try things out for a while, perhaps live together at some point. see how that goes, and make our decision about whether we want this after that.
Why wouldn't we want this?
Sirius asked, something uncomfortable settling in the pit of his stomach at the idea.
I thought you said the mating bond was there for a reason, that it linked together two souls that were perfectly balanced.
Well, yes,
Remus conceded, but then he turned to Sirius, his voice firm as he added,
but it doesn't have to dictate our futures if we don't want it to. If we try this, and in a few weeks you find that I'm absolutely intolerable, then you can break off the bond and go, and we'll say no more about it.
And if
Sirius swallowed and steeled himself before giving voice to his fears.
you decide that I'm absolutely intolerable?
I doubt that very much.
Remus said softly. Sirius gave him a look, but Remus just smiled.
Call me old-fashioned, but I believe in fate. My mate has been brought into my life through a series of events, and I believe that things happen for a reason. But in the unlikely occurrence that we get 2 weeks in, and I find that I cannot stand the sight of you any longer, then yes, I could also break the bond.
Sirius nodded, not feeling as reassured by that as he'd hoped. Remus noted his change in mood and shifted closer. Sirius leaned into the taller man's side subconsciously and found that he was immediately comforted, in a way that he'd only ever felt with James. But this was also wholly different to the way James made him feel. James made him feel confident and able to face whatever he needed to. Remus made him feel safe, protected, and Sirius hadn't realized until this very moment just how much he'd wanted to feel like he could let someone other than himself protect him.
All right,
Sirius whispered. He felt Remus still beside him and turned to look up at the taller man. Remus was gazing down at him apprehensively, and Sirius couldn't help but smile at the cautious hope he saw in the Alpha's amber eyes. He made his voice more firm as he repeated,
all right, let's try it.
Remus let out a shaky breath, his lips a little wobbly as he returned Sirius's smile. He dipped forwards as though he might kiss Sirius, but then he paused and pulled himself back as he said,
I want you to know, Sirius, that there really is no obligation here. I know that as alphas go, I'm not necessarily a prime specimen, but...
Who told you that?
Sirius demanded hotly, anger coursing through him rapidly. He immediately wanted to kill whoever had made Remus feel that way. Remus blinked at the visceral reaction.
No one told me that.
He said carefully, then his mouth turned down at the corners, and Sirius hated it. Remus gestured to himself and went on.
Nobody needed to. I'm not blind. I know I'm not exactly a treat for the eyes.
What do you mean?
Sirius was really struggling to control himself. The need to fight the cause of Remus's doubt in himself was overwhelming. The scathing look Remus sent him only made his blood boil hotter.
The scars, Sirius.
What about them?
He tried not to let his chin tilt up in defiance, but it went anyway. Remus faltered, then gazed at him assessingly. Remus's voice was somewhat strangled.
Are you saying that they don't bother you?
Not at all.
Remus let out a sound like he'd been punched in the gut, his eyes going wide as he gaped at Sirius. Even so, Sirius could see the doubt lingering in his expression, and he couldn't stand to think that Remus didn't believe him on this. So he surged forwards and crawled into the Alpha's lap, straddling him with a knee either side of the man's narrow hips, and when he was seated, he took Remus's face in his hands ever so gently, looking straight into his eyes, and breathed.
I think you're beautiful.
Oh.
Remus's lower lip trembled slightly, and he blinked rapidly as he stared right back. Sirius lowered his face slowly and pressed their lips together, sighing contentedly when the thrumming in his chest finally eased. Remus reached up to twine one hand around Sirius's hair, and his other was on the Omega's hip, pulling him closer, closer.
What, Remus, wait.
Sirius panted, fighting to focus his mind over the swirling fog of lust that had descended at the feel of Remus's hands on him. The Alpha stopped moving instantly, and Sirius leaned back to look down at him.
What do we do about your rut?
What do you mean?
Remus asked, his eyes a bit hazy and his lips already slightly swollen. Gods, he really was beautiful.
Focus, Black. Well, if you're right in thinking that it's been delayed because of my presence, then I'd understand if you needed to ask the agency to send someone else to get you through.
Absolutely not.
Remus snarled, his eyes suddenly narrow and fierce, causing Sirius to lean back further. The Alpha grimaced and smoothed his thumb over Sirius's hip bone in apology as he went on.
Why would I want anyone else for my ruts?
Well,
Sirius felt his own cheeks flush, and he forced himself to say,
I don't want anything bad to happen to you because of a suppressed rut.
Oh, love.
Remus murmured, his face softening.
Nothing bad is going to happen. I might be a bit irritable perhaps, but if I am right, then we should sync up when you next go into heat.
Oh,
Sirius muttered, ducking his head so that he could hide behind his hair. There were some very vast holes in his education, apparently, and his ignorance was becoming clearer by the minute. But then Remus was gripping his chin, making him look into his face, and the lack of judgment there calmed the roiling emotions in Sirius's gut.
Besides,
The alpha purred, his tone deep and rich and all-consuming in a way that made Sirius want to wriggle. Remus smirked, as though he'd sensed Sirius's repressed urge, and went on.
why would I ever want another when I could have the most beautiful Omega?
Sirius's heart flipped at those words, and he crushed his mouth to Remus's once more. The kiss quickly became heated, needy, and Sirius could hear the slightly whiny edge to his own gasps as Remus's tongue explored his mouth. The alpha's grip on him became rough, and Sirius's eyes rolled in his head as heat flooded his lower abdomen. He breathed in through his nose as the spicy edge to Remus's scent began to bloom. It was delicious, intoxicating. Sirius would willingly drown in the smell.
Alpha.
Sirius whimpered absent-mindedly, and Remus bit into Sirius's lower lip with a deep groan when he rocked his hips down, grinding their inflating shafts together as he sought friction.
Omega.
Remus growled into his mouth.
So good for me, love. So good.
Remus tilted his head further upwards and pressed another deep kiss to Sirius's lips. That thing in Sirius's chest suddenly pulled taut, and Sirius let out a harsh gasp as white-hot pain flared through him. His back arched, and he felt his joggers flood and become soaked in slick. He grasped Remus's shoulders as panic tore through him. No. This wasn't right. It was too early. He wasn't due. Remus cut into his thoughts, his hands tightening on Sirius's hips, and his voice worried as he asked urgently,
What is it?
Sirius choked as pain shot up his spine, followed by another wave of slick, and he knew that when he stood, Remus's thighs would be damp from it. Remus seemed to feel it at that exact same moment, and his eyes darkened immediately. The alpha's nostrils flared as he took a slow, deep inhale, and Sirius almost drooled when the alpha's scent, that spice running right through it, burst around him.
Oh,
Remus murmured, and Sirius's mind went hazy as the alpha's hands dug harder into him. Sirius could see the effort it took for Remus to speak through his clenched teeth.
were you expecting a heat?
No.
Sirius groaned, trying to keep his hips still as another wave of burning lust tore through him.
No, it's a week early.
It's all right.
Remus ground out, but Sirius could feel the shaking in his hands as he fought against his impulses.
You're all right. Maybe the mating bond.
Remus trailed off as another flood of slick soaked through Sirius's trousers, and a deep, constant rumble started in his chest. Sirius's mind swam at the sound.
Alpha.
He breathed, leaning in to kiss Remus, but Remus gently placed a trembling hand over his mouth. Sirius whined at the rejection, and Remus gave him a pained look.
I know, love. I'm sorry.
He crooned, eyes flitting over Sirius's face. Sirius could feel Remus's arousal getting thicker somehow, and he whimpered softly as he poked his tongue out and licked at Remus's fingers. The alpha's amber eyes rolled back into his head. Then he snarled and focused on Sirius, the command heavy in his tone as he said,
Sirius, I need you to go and wait for me in the bedroom. Try and come back. Yeah. I need you to hold on for me just a little longer. Can you do that?
Yes, Remus.
Sirius breathed, and Remus released him. Sirius was tempted for a moment to ignore the instructions and dive for the man's trousers, but he wanted to be good for his alpha, so instead he got up and made his way slowly to the bedroom, feeling his slick running down the backs of his thighs as he went. Chapter 3: The Moon. Somehow, Sirius made it to the bedroom, and he smiled when he saw that the room was bathed in moonlight that filtered in through the wide window set into the back wall. He was about to sit down on the bed when he remembered his soaked trousers. He also remembered Remus's words, but the smell of his own arousal mingled with the alpha's was making it very hard to think. He had to find something to do to occupy his mind while he waited for Remus, so he began to build a nest. He'd done this before, at home alone. He'd never made a nest for the purpose of inviting an alpha in to share it with him. It had to be perfect. It had to be perfect for Remus. He pulled the huge duvet from the bed and pushed it into one corner of the room, then opened the wardrobe and dug through it until he found some blankets. They were old and a little musty, So Sirius pulled a few of Remus's jumpers from their hangers and spread them over the rolled-up blankets to make the nest smell more like the alpha. Finally, Sirius pulled the jumper he wore up and over his head, adding it into the mix so that his scent would be part of the nest, too. He just stepped back to look at his work when the door clicked open behind him.
Alpha.
Sirius murmured, the man's scent hitting him before he had even turned around. He spun to find Remus standing in the doorway, his hands resting on either side of the doorframe. It almost looked like he was using it to hold himself back as he stared into the room. At Sirius. Sirius smiled at him, his mind already going hazy, and he purred.
I've made us a nest.
The alpha's eyes shifted to the corner, to the pile of blankets and jumpers, and widened.
It's beautiful.
Remus breathed, the awe clear in his voice, and Sirius preened under the praise. He made to walk towards the alpha, but Remus rumbled.
Stop.
So he stopped. Remus swallowed hard before he said,
I need you to be present for this conversation, Sirius. If you can't give me the answers I need, then I'm going to have to lock you in this room until your heat is over.
Sirius whined, his chest already aching at the thought of spending his heat without his mate. He could tell from the steady throb of pain in his lower back that this was going to be a difficult one, more difficult than any of the heats he'd previously borne alone, and he honestly didn't know if he'd make it through without the alpha's help.
I know, love.
Remus grunted, and Sirius saw him sway slightly as he forced himself to remain outside of the room.
I know, and it'll fucking kill me too. But if you can't tell me lucidly that this is what you want, if you can't tell me how to take care of you after, then I can't be here.
The desperation in Remus's tone made Sirius reel inside his own mind, and he forced himself to swim to the surface of the fog that had settled over him.
Remus.
He croaked, and he saw Remus's shoulders sag slightly, relief etched across his face. Sirius straightened and dug his own nails into his palms to keep himself centered.
Remus, I need you. I want you with me for my heat. I want you to fuck me, not me. Take me how you need to. And when we need a break, I want us to share the nest I've built for us.
And what do you need from me after your heat, Sirius?
Remus panted, his voice so tight that it sounded like he was struggling to speak. Sirius heard the wood of the doorframe crack ominously as the muscles in Remus's arms flexed.
Baths.
He blurted, his own skin itching as his Omega instincts fought to claw their way out of him, to throw him at his Alpha's mercy.
Baths and rest and chocolate, please, Remus.
Something snapped, and Remus pounced. Their lips crashed together as Sirius was carried backwards, and he groaned when his back hit the wall. Remus immediately broke the kiss to bury his face against Sirius's neck, and he took a long, shuddering inhale. Sirius keened when Remus's breath puffed out over his gland, and the Alpha murmured against his skin.
Fuck, you smell so good.
I do.
Sirius breathed, his vision blurring as Remus nipped lightly at his throat.
Like coffee and lemons and...
Remus's nose tickled his skin as the man took another deep inhale. His voice was impossibly low as he added,
And dark chocolate.
Oh.
Sirius whispered, his mind far too clouded for him to be able to form full sentences. He gasped and arched when Remus slid one long leg between his thighs, nestling right up against Sirius's crotch. The pressure relieved some of his need, but it was by no means enough. His whole lower back was burning, and tears stung his eyes as he tipped his head back against the wall.
What is it, love?
Remus asked, when he'd lifted his head from Sirius's neck and took in his expression. Concern filled the Alpha's eyes, and it only deepened when he lifted one large hand and rested it against Sirius's cheek.
Jesus, you're burning up so quickly.
Hurts.
Sirius whimpered, leaning into the touch and looking up at Remus through wet lashes. The Alpha's breath hitched, and Sirius wondered just how wrecked he already looked. The Alpha's pupils were dilating rapidly, his sweet, spicy scent shoving its way up Sirius's nose as it swelled around them. Remus seemed almost frozen, and Sirius made a broken noise in the back of his throat as he ground his erection against the toned muscle of the man's thigh.
Gods, Sirius.
Remus groaned, the hand on Sirius's cheek sliding over his jaw to tangle in the sweaty black hair at the back of his head, his other hand gripping Sirius's hip. He used his hold to encourage Sirius to rock again, and the Omega complied eagerly, rolling his hips and chasing relief. He was already panting, his vision swimming as his lust became almost unbearable. Gods, he was going to burst with it. Sirius cried out in genuine distress when Remus suddenly pushed him back against the wall and slid his leg out from under him.
No, please.
Easy.
Remus cooed, his grip on Sirius's hair tightening as he tipped the Omega's head further back. Sirius stared up at Remus, who was gazing down at him with such wonder and need that he wanted to hide from it. But he couldn't close his eyes, couldn't turn away. A thrill ran through him as the Alpha leaned closer and murmured against his lips.
You'll get what you want, I promise. But it would be such a waste to have you get off on my thigh. No.
Don't care.
Sirius huffed, the pain and his unfulfilled desire making him irritable.
Just want to come.
Do you now?
Remus chuckled, pressing soft kisses to Sirius's lips, then along his cheekbone down to his jaw. Between kisses he went on.
And just how would you like to come, love? You want me to suck your cock? Make you spill all over my tongue? Or do you want my tongue somewhere else? Perhaps you'd like to come while I eat you out. Or can you only come on my cock, as deep as it'll go, locked on my knot?
Fuck.
Sirius squeaked, his mouth entirely dry as mental images flashed rapidly behind his eyes. All of those options sound heavenly, but also equally sinful when Remus offered them in that honeyed, dangerous tone. Remus seemed to read his thoughts because he chuckled again into the dip between Sirius's neck and his shoulder. But then he ran his tongue over Sirius's gland, and everything shifted. Remus gasped, pulling away rapidly, and Sirius could only watch as he gritted his teeth, his head falling forward and his grip on Sirius's hip tightening. Sirius groaned at the pleasurable pain, but the sound choked off when Remus lifted his head again, and Sirius saw that something behind the man's eyes had changed. They were still dark, but the sliver of amber iris glowed brightly in the moonlight, and his gaze was sharp. In fact, Remus's whole face had gone a little sharp, his features set. He straightened, and he seemed to grow right before Sirius's eyes. Sirius opened his mouth to ask Remus if he was all right, but then he tasted it, right on his tongue, Remus's scent. There was nothing of the sweet edge to it now. It was entirely comprised of that delicious spicy element that Sirius couldn't quite put his finger on. Sirius's whole body went hot as he realized what had happened. Remus's rut had finally been triggered.
We've got all night, Omega.
Remus rumbled, his voice gravelly, making goosebumps rise on Sirius's skin. He leaned forward and sniffed at Sirius's hairline, and Sirius made himself stay as still as possible as the Alpha examined him. He tried not to shiver when the man's hot breath ghosted over his cheek.
We've got all of your heat, really. I can think of so many things that I'd like to do to you.
Remus pulled back, his grin feral as he rocked his hips against the Omegas. Sirius panted, struggling to focus as Remus's hand left his hair, his grin fading as he pressed his thumb to Sirius's lower lip. Sirius let his mouth fall open, and Remus's eyes were almost entirely black when he added,
Including making good use of this pretty little mouth of yours.
Sirius outright melted. He knew that his joggers were absolutely ruined, could feel the sodden material clinging to his thighs when he shifted, trying to ease the stabbing pain in his spine. Gods, he wanted so badly. He wanted this man to take him, to use him, to do all sorts of filthy things to his body, but mostly, he just wanted to be full. He wanted an alpha to fill him. He wanted this alpha. So he locked eyes with Remus, and purposefully flicked the point of his tongue against the tip of his thumb. Remus snarled, his teeth bared and his eyes flashing as he slid his hand down from Sirius's mouth and braced it against Sirius's throat. He didn't grip, didn't squeeze, but he used the light hold he had to press Sirius back against the wall again. It was a dominating move, a move designed to remind Sirius of his place. Sirius had to fight the ridiculous urge to lie down on the floor and expose his belly to his alpha.
Be good, Omega.
The tone was harsh, direct, and Sirius responded to it instinctively, going completely pliant as he registered the change. Up until now, Remus had been so very sweet to him, had been considerate and attentive to his every need. But this was Remus's alpha side, more clearly on display than it had been the whole time Sirius had been here. This Remus was more demanding, more expectant, but despite his need becoming almost painful, Sirius was more than willing to be good for him, even if he didn't know quite what he was in for. He needn't have worried. As though he could sense Sirius's pain, it took Remus no time at all to drop to his knees before the Omega, apparently still eager to attend to Sirius's needs. His large hands reached out and swiftly tugged Sirius's joggers down, and his touch was almost tender as he held each ankle to steady Sirius as he stepped out of the garment. Remus pushed it to the side, then looked up at Sirius as he slowly trailed the fingers of one hand up the inside of his trembling left thigh.
Oh, sweetheart, you're absolutely soaked.
Remus purred teasingly, and Sirius keened as Remus ran 2 fingers all the way up and over his practically dripping entrance. The Alpha drew his fingers to his own face, and Sirius stopped breathing as he watched the slick digits disappear into Remus's mouth. He sucked at them, moaning in pleasure, and Sirius felt all of his breath punch out of him at the sound. Then Remus released his fingers with a lewd pop and reached down once more to scoop the slick from Sirius's right thigh. This time, he lifted them high and pressed them to Sirius's lips.
Taste yourself.
Sirius obediently opened his mouth, and his eyes rolled into the back of his head at the taste of his slick on Remus's skin. He'd tasted his own slick before, out of curiosity, and had found that the taste wasn't necessarily unpleasant. But from Remus's fingers, combined with the pheromones that were pouring out of the Alpha, he'd never tasted a better combination in his life. He suddenly wondered what the combination of his slick and Remus's cum would taste like.
Come back, Sirius.
Remus prompted gently, and Sirius blinked and looked down, realizing that he'd wandered inside his own thoughts and had been staring at a point over Remus's head. But Remus was smiling up at him, and Sirius shivered when the Alpha breathed.
There he is. You gonna stay with me?
Yes.
Sirius breathed.
Sorry, I'm here.
You're all right. Now be an angel and lift your left leg onto my shoulder, yeah?
Remus murmured, his smile sharpening again. Sirius's breath got stuck somewhere in his throat, but he complied, lifting his leg and letting it hook over Remus's shoulder. The moment he'd done it, he realized why it had been asked of him. The position opened him up, made his hole accessible to Remus. The Alpha seemed to see the understanding dawn on him, and the resulting laugh was low and dark.
Don't worry, I think you're going to enjoy this.
Without any further warning, Remus reached between Sirius's thighs and pressed the pads of 2 fingers against the Omega's hole. Sirius's head tipped back so suddenly that it hit the wall with a dull thump, but Remus didn't remove his digits. Instead, he pressed harder, and Sirius gasped as they breached his rim. He was still a little loose from earlier, but it took him a couple of seconds to get used to the intrusion. Then white-hot desire flooded him, his already hard cock filling out further as Remus pulled his fingers back the smallest fraction. Sirius's mind went wild, and he writhed against the wall, trying to grind down against Remus's hand.
Desperate, needy little thing, aren't you?
Remus crooned, and Sirius whimpered as he twisted his thick fingers deeper.
So wet, so ready.
For you, Alpha.
Sirius breathed.
Only for you.
Good.
Remus panted, then he was thrusting his fingers hard and fast into Sirius's hole, pulling out strings of slick that ran down Sirius's thighs with each retreat. Sirius rolled his hips down, groaning as he sank lower onto Remus's fingers, and Remus praised.
Such a good boy for me. So pretty like this, my Omega.
Usually that phrase would have caused him to stagger. Whenever he'd been with another Alpha, if they'd tried to verbally claim him like that, he'd pulled them up on it, had reminded them that he wasn't theirs, that he didn't belong to them. It had put him in some very difficult positions, especially when he was servicing someone during their rut. But he'd been firm about it, had needed that boundary to remain clear, no matter the circumstances. Hearing it now, hearing how it sounded in Remus's lovely voice, he understood what it actually meant to belong to someone. It made him want Remus all the more.
Alpha.
Sirius panted, his voice cracking around the edges as his head thrashed from side to side.
It hurts. I need more, need to feel more of you. Not enough,
All right, sweetheart, I've got you.
Remus murmured, his free hand coming up to cup Sirius's balls. Sirius's mind went blank as Remus tugged, and he could feel the edge of his orgasm approaching fast, the heat building and building inside him. His hands rose to card through Remus's curls, trying to pull the Alpha closer, and Remus tutted.
Look at you, poor thing. You need your Alpha to make you feel good.
Please, Alpha, please.
If Sirius hadn't bitten into his own lower lip, he would have screamed. Remus had swallowed him whole, right to the root on the first go. The feeling of the Alpha's hot, tight throat closing around his aching shaft was too much, and Sirius came hard, tears spilling down his cheeks with the force of it. He pulled at Remus's hair in a silent plea, but Remus simply hummed around him, swallowing steadily as he continued to press against his prostate. Sirius was outright sobbing by the time the Alpha acknowledged his request and released him. Remus eased his fingers out moments later and was on his feet in seconds, wrapping his arms around Sirius and pulling him towards the bed as he showered kisses and praises over his tingling skin. Sirius sagged against him, half expecting to be laid out so that they could rest, but then Remus was spinning him around and pushing him down onto the mattress on his hands and knees. Sirius couldn't quite get his brain to communicate with his mouth, couldn't make himself say anything, but that problem was soon forgotten when Remus gripped his arched cheeks.
You're a fucking feast, Sirius.
Remus purred, his thumbs tugging at Sirius's fluttering rim. Sirius whined from embarrassment and overstimulation and pitched forward to bury his face in the sheets below him. His head shot up again, and he near enough shrieked when Remus snarled and raised one of his hands, letting it fall in a stinging slap against the taut skin of Sirius's arse. Sirius turned his head to gape over his shoulder, but the Alpha gazed back calmly as he rumbled.
You let me hear you, Omega.
And with that, he ducked his head and forced his tongue into Sirius's hole. Sirius wailed and tried to squirm away, but Remus's hands had moved to grip his hips, and the strength he'd gained from the activation of his rut meant that Sirius was going nowhere. The taller man didn't want him to. Thankfully, the shock of being stretched around that strong muscle had reconnected Sirius's mouth.
Remus,
He gasped.
Alpha, please, no, too much, I can't.
Yes, you can.
Remus murmured, lifting his head to speak, but letting his thumbs sink into Sirius, pulling and holding him open. Sirius's eyes rolled in his head, and his cock, which had hardly softened after he'd spilled down Remus's throat, was already stiff and bumping against his abdomen again. He subconsciously rocked back, the feel of Remus's hands too much, yet not enough, and the Alpha growled in approval.
See? There's my good boy. Now you're going to come one more time before I'm inside you. You can do that for me, can't you, Sirius?
Oh, I can do it.
Sirius whimpered, his hands balling into fists around the bed sheets. He would do it. He could do it to please his Alpha. He groaned and rocked again when Remus pulled his thumbs wider apart.
Of course you can.
Remus cooed.
My Omega is so good for me.
Alpha.
Sirius moaned, the words slipping from him almost automatically this time. Remus sighed contentedly, like something inside him had been soothed, and he instantly dropped back down and laved his tongue over Sirius's hole. Sirius's back arched hard, but Remus lapped at him again before he pushed his tongue in as far as it would go. Sirius made sure to keep his face unobstructed, let Remus hear all of the pathetic noises that fell from his lips as the Alpha ate him ravenously. He managed to turn his head to look back at Remus, and froze under the intense focus of the eyes that were already locked onto his face.
Come on, pretty boy.
Remus rumbled, pulling back slightly so that he could talk. Sirius's whole body heated once more when he saw how wet the man's mouth and chin were with a mixture of Sirius's slick and his own spit. Remus replaced his tongue with 3 long fingers as he held Sirius's gaze and prompted.
Show me how good you can be, just for me. Show your Alpha how good he makes you feel.
It was the words that tipped him over the edge, words that reminded him that he wasn't just his Alpha's Omega, but that he also in turn had ownership over this Alpha. Sirius came for a second time, feeling hot liquid splash up against his chest, his arms. He was sure there was some on the sheets below him too, but he couldn't bring himself to care as he went boneless and collapsed onto the mattress. His whole body was sticky and sweaty, shaking with exertion, and yet his back and stomach still ached. He had come twice, but it had hardly soothed the deep want inside him, and he could only think of one thing. Luckily, it seemed that Remus had once again understood him without words, because he gripped Sirius's hips and flipped him onto his back before crawling up onto the mattress and between Sirius's legs. Sirius gazed up at the Alpha's wild, dark eyes, then traveled down, until they locked on what Sirius wanted most. He keened when he saw how much thicker Remus's hard cock had become with his rut, how the base was already a little swollen.
Nearly there, sweetheart.
Remus growled, his voice almost obscured by the near-constant rumbling he was emitting from somewhere deep in his chest. He gripped Sirius behind the knees and tugged, sliding the Omega down the bed towards him and parting his thighs in one smooth movement. Sirius stared up at the Alpha hazily as the man went on.
Nearly there now. Just gotta knot you, then you can rest, all right?
Aye.
Sirius frowned, struggling to formulate the words, but Remus paused, and his face turned a little more gentle as he focused on Sirius.
Tell me, love.
Remus murmured, his hand lifting to brush Sirius's sweaty hair back from his face. Sirius's eyes flickered shut, warmth filling him at the clear affection in the action, and it gave him the energy to ask for what he needed.
I want you to bite me.
He slurred, the words still harder to form than they should have been. Remus went entirely still above him, and though his eyes went to Sirius's throat, There was suddenly a sadness about him that made Sirius's chest ache.
I can't.
Remus breathed eventually, tearing his eyes away from Sirius's neck. He smiled shakily down at Sirius as he added,
But I promise, I'll do something that'll make it better, okay?
Sirius whined, disappointment crushing his chest, but he nodded, acknowledging that for whatever reason, Remus had put up a boundary, and no matter how painful it was, he would respect it. But then the heat was building in him again, his slick starting to leak from him once more, and Remus's expression shifted as he inhaled and took in the change to Sirius's scent.
Gonna knot you?
Remus growled, reaching between and lining his tip up with Sirius's entrance.
Gonna fill you up, make it all better for my Omega.
And with that, he snapped his hips forward and sank into Sirius in one long, fluid movement. Tears sprung to Sirius's eyes as his body sang with how right this was, how good his alpha felt inside him, filling him, taking away that awful burning. Then Remus was moving, his thrust steady and strong, and Sirius reached up to grip the alpha's shoulders, needing something to hold on to. Their previous conversation left his mind completely as Remus's shaft pressed against his prostate, over and over, and he began pulling at the alpha, trying to get him closer.
Please, Alpha, claim me. Please want to be yours.
I know, sweetheart.
Remus groaned, and there was pain laced through his tone as his arm locked, keeping him held above Sirius, his mouth resolutely away from the Omega's neck. There was something close to pleading in the Alpha's amber eyes as he blurted,
I know, I want that too, but
The Alpha suddenly gritted his teeth, and Sirius gasped when he felt his rim stretching as Remus thrust forward and forced the flaring base of his cock inside him. Once it was in, it swelled, and immediately triggered Sirius's third orgasm of the night. His head fell back among the pillows as Remus snarled above him, rocking his hips once, twice more before his knot began to pulse and Sirius felt liquid warmth pumping into him. It kept going, the sheer amount of it making his head spin, and it was only when Remus sagged that Sirius's mind caught up, and he realized that his alpha had finished without claiming him. Sirius sobbed, somehow still feeling empty, unsatisfied, even though he was filled to the absolute brim with his alpha.
Alpha doesn't want me. He won't claim me. I'm no good. I'm not a good enough Omega for Alpha to claim.
He was snapped out of the rapid spiral when Remus reached between them and slid his fingers against Sirius's stretched rim, right where his knot was pressing. Sirius hissed at the sensation, but Remus cooed soothing noises as he carefully pulled his digits away, all the while staring down at Sirius. Slowly, the alpha lifted fingers that were coated with a mixture of Sirius's slick and Remus's cum, and holding the Omega's gaze, he gently rubbed the fluids along Sirius's throat, focusing on massaging it into his glands. Sirius whined, his cock twitching valiantly as it tried to fill again. But then the agonizing despair in his chest began to ease, and he gaped up at Remus in wonder.
better.
Remus rasped, and Sirius took a moment to consider the question. Yes, all right, the action had taken the raw edge off what felt like an outright rejection, but he still felt the echoes of that need to be bitten, to have his alpha mark him, to let the world know exactly who he belonged to. So Sirius just shrugged non-committally. Remus nodded sadly, then slid his hands under Sirius's back.
Hold on to me. Let's get you into your nest and I'll explain.
Sirius obediently wrapped his arms around Remus's shoulders and his legs around his waist, grunting as the alpha straightened up from the bed and lifted Sirius with him. The action was as smooth as it could be, but it still caused Remus to shift inside him, that bulk tugging against him unpleasantly. Sirius clenched his jaw in an effort not to jerk away, knowing that this would only make it worse, and Remus breathed apologies against his shoulder as he moved them over to Sirius's nest and rapidly sank down to sit in the middle of it with Sirius in his lap. When they were both comfortable, Remus spoke again.
I can't claim you right now, Sirius.
Remus murmured, exhaustion already filling his voice as his rut receded for the time being. Sirius frowned down at him, confused and a little hurt. Wasn't that what Remus wanted? Had he already decided that he didn't want Sirius as his mate?
Why?
Sirius pushed, his voice husky from overuse due to all of the noises that had been so methodically wrung from him.
Why can't you claim me?
I need you to be fully lucid when you ask that of me, love.
Remus explained gently, and the tightness in Sirius's chest eased significantly at the words. It wasn't that Remus didn't want him then. It was that respect for Sirius's choices once more that had made him hold back. Sirius wondered how having someone respect his needs could be at once such a blessing and such a curse. He made himself focus as Remus kept talking.
It's not a decision to be taken lightly, and I need to be fully sure that you're not just asking for it because of your heat.
His voice was firm, his mind obviously made up, but it didn't stop Sirius from pouting.
But I want you.
He wheedled, batting his eyelashes at Remus and letting his lower lip stick out just a little. It was a move he'd used many times on James, and more often than not, it led to him getting whatever it was that he was after. So he was very surprised when Remus just laughed.
Can I expect you to sulk every time I say no to you?
He teased, one eyebrow raised. Sirius would have been offended if there hadn't been such evident fondness on the man's scarred face.
I don't sulk.
Sirius huffed.
I just don't like not getting what I want.
Well, you'd better get used to it.
Remus chuckled, taking any sting out of his words by nuzzling his nose up against Sirius's jaw. Sirius went pliant in the Alpha's arms as his mouth trailed down his neck and over his collarbone, and Remus's breath was lovely and warm against his shoulder as he went on.
I'll give you everything you could ever need, Sirius, but I won't take advantage of you. If there's even the slightest doubt in my mind about it, then I'm going to say no.
When Remus leaned back again, his voice was soft as he added,
I hope you can understand.
Well, how could Sirius say no to that? He nodded glumly, and the Alpha pressed an apologetic kiss to his lips before he eased back, settling against the blankets Sirius had used to build up the walls of the nest. Sirius went with him, collapsing onto his chest as exhaustion hit him. He knew that he should make the most of the break before the heat returned and made him insatiable again, but he still wanted to.
Lie still, Omega,
Remus warned, gripping the back of Sirius's neck gently. He stopped wriggling instinctively, and in that second, his body gave up its fight, and the edges of his vision started to darken. Remus pressed a lazy kiss to the top of his head, and the Alpha's voice was thick with sleep as he murmured,
Good boy.
Chapter 4: The Morning. Sirius woke again when the early morning sun was bright enough in the room to shine through his eyelids. He groaned as he slowly came around and felt how sticky and sore he already was this early into the heat. From his own record, he probably still had around 12 hours to go, and when he was on his own, he usually didn't feel this bad until he was getting close to the end. Then again, he didn't usually feel as satisfied by his own hands and toys as he had in that brief moment between Remus rubbing their fluids into his glands and unconsciousness. He supposed he would take feeling disgusting if that's what he would get in return. He was just contemplating trying to get up and go for a shower when a pair of large hands on his hips suddenly tightened. He peeled his face from the warm, also sticky skin it had been pressed to and blinked bleakly up at Remus. The Alpha was already awake, his eyes wild and dark as he stared down at Sirius. Sirius gasped when he felt Remus's cock, still buried deep inside him, throb. It had already started to fill out again. He shifted, then gritted his teeth when pain flared up his spine, that unbearable heat following it soon after.
Easy, love.
Remus rumbled, his hands smoothing slowly up and down Sirius's ribs. His deep, honeyed voice was soothing, and Sirius's eyelids drooped, but he had to do something about this pain, had to catch the heat before it got too much again. So he carefully eased himself into a sitting position, wiping at his flushing face and pushing his sweaty hair back self-consciously. He yelped when Remus's hips rocked upwards, nudging his shaft deeper, and Sirius gaped down at the Alpha, his hands still tangled in his own hair. Remus was looking at him with something like adoration, and Sirius blushed hotter when the man breathed.
Beautiful.
I'm a mess.
Sirius protested, still close enough to the surface of his mind to feel embarrassed by the intensity of Remus's gaze. He blinked when the Alpha simply gave him a wolfish grin.
Well, seeing as I'm the one who made that mess, I think I have the right to call that beautiful.
Remus teased. Sirius rolled his eyes, trying to ignore the way those words had made his chest and abdomen tighten, but he couldn't ignore when Remus rocked upwards again, and he moaned lightly as his head fell back, sparks of pleasure replacing the stabs of pain in his back. Remus's voice sounded strained when he added,
I mean it, Sirius. You really are a fucking sight to behold right now.
Remus.
Sirius breathed, leaning forward again to brace his hands on the Alpha's chest as he shifted down against his lap, his back arching as his hole was stretched more with each movement. Remus's eyes locked onto his again, and Sirius murmured,
Please.
Move, Omega.
Remus growled, the command clear in his tone as he grasped the backs of Sirius's thighs.
Take what you need.
Sirius immediately pushed up onto his knees, both of them groaning at the drag of his rim along Remus's length. When there was just the tip left inside, Sirius dropped down again rapidly, crying out when stars burst in his vision. He was already so wet, the glide hardly burned, yet the heat that coiled up his spine was intense, and drove Sirius to repeat the action.
Christ, look at you.
Remus rasped, his hands sliding further up Sirius's thighs to grip his arse, the muscles in his forearms standing out in cords as he helped Sirius to lift up.
Fucking yourself on your alpha's cock. Such a needy thing, my Omega.
Sirius moaned, made himself hold Remus's gaze as he dropped down again. The alpha's pupils blew wide when Sirius bit into his own lower lip, and he reached up with one hand to grip Sirius's face, squeezing his cheek slightly and making Sirius pout, eyes locked on his mouth. As Sirius rose, Remus's fingers tightened around his face, his scarred lips pulling back from clenched teeth, and Sirius suddenly understood that the alpha was holding back, was letting him get off how he needed to right now. The thought made slick flood from him, coating Remus's cock as he slowly pulled off, and Remus's nostrils flared.
What are you serious?
The alpha choked out, apparently using talking as a method to keep himself centered. Sirius wasn't complaining. Remus's voice was pushing him higher and higher, and the more breathless the taller man got, the faster Sirius moved. But Sirius was struggling to form words, was already sliding under a thick heat-induced fog. When he stayed silent, Remus's large hand slipped from his face and trailed down his throat, bracketing the base of Sirius's pale neck, a possessive hold as well as a prompt. The words died on his tongue when he realized that he could already feel Remus's knot forming, and he dropped down harder, whimpering when the swell pushed inside him. He sat back and turned his long, slow movements into small bounces, keeping the knot snug against his rim as it grew. Remus snarled in approval, but he raised one eyebrow, indicating that he was still waiting for Sirius's answer.
I'm a needy Omega for my alpha's cock.
Remus froze, his eyes widening, and Sirius instantly paused, not sure of what he'd said or done that had caused the reaction. But then Remus was scrambling to sit up with Sirius in his lap, still rolling his hips in an attempt to hold back the burning lust. Remus's touch was more gentle this time as he pushed Sirius's hair back, his gaze dancing over the Omega's face as though he was searching for something. He sounded almost awestruck when he demanded,
Say that again.
Sirius frowned, running back what he'd said. Then his eyebrows rose high on his forehead when he picked out the phrase that he thought Remus was referring to. It was something he hadn't said out loud in as many words yet, although Remus had been quite happily bandying the term about from the first possible moment. Sirius licked at his lips to wet them, and ventured,
My alpha.
The noise that tore itself from Remus's throat was barely human. Without warning, he deftly flipped them so that Sirius landed underneath him, and the Omega cried out when Remus's hips snapped forward, making sure that his knot didn't pull too much. When he was settled between Sirius's splayed thighs, Remus gazed down at him with blazing eyes and murmured,
Again.
My alpha.
Sirius panted, and Remus growled and thrust into him as much as the knot already locked inside Sirius would allow. Sirius whined, his back arching up off the blankets below him as Remus reached under his hips to tilt his pelvis and thrust again. Sirius's eyes rolled into his head when the new angle had Remus crashing right against his prostate, and he came, gasping through his release. It only took the edge off the heat, but Remus didn't let up, was still rocking into him with slow, purposeful motions. Sirius's hands gripped Remus's shoulders, and the alpha dipped his head and pressed his tongue against the gland on Sirius's neck.
Again.
Remus rasped as he lapped at the skin of the swollen spot, over and over.
Come again, sweetheart, please, just for me, just for your alpha.
Alpha.
Sirius whimpered, his whole body tingling as the pressure on his gland sent hormones coursing through him. Then Remus lightly scraped his teeth over the spot, and Sirius came again, rolling his hips as he clenched around Remus. The alpha's knot pulsed, and Remus groaned as he followed Sirius over the edge, his tongue flattened out over the gland as he filled Sirius. That last flood of Omega hormones made Sirius instantly lightheaded, and his vision went black. The sun was high in the sky when Sirius opened his eyes. He could see it through the window he faced. He blinked when he registered smooth material under his cheek instead of skin this time, and he immediately tried to sit up. He quickly understood that he'd somehow been moved to the bed, but he also knew inherently that he was alone in it, and his chest already ached at the apparent absence of Remus. His head swam, the lack of food and water over the past 12 hours suddenly hitting him with force. His voice sounded pitiful in his own ears as he called out,
Alpha.
Immediately, there were hurried footsteps from somewhere else in the house, starting quite far away, but coming rapidly closer, and then the mattress behind him was dipping, and a large, warm hand stroked over the back of his neck and slid under his jaw, cupping his face. Sirius sighed gratefully as he let the hand take the weight of his head, as warm skin pressed to his bare back.
I've got you, love.
Remus murmured, his voice tired but tender. Before Sirius could turn to look at him, the edge of a glass was being pressed to his lips, and Remus prompted,
Drink this for me, yeah.
Sirius obligingly swallowed the cool, refreshing water, gulping it down as Remus tipped the glass for him, only pulling away when it was empty. He turned his head to squint behind him and found Remus hovering over him, a small smile on his face. Sirius smiled back and whispered,
Hi.
Hello.
Remus said, the amusement clear in his voice as he gazed down at Sirius.
Sorry that I wasn't here when you woke up. I was quite thirsty.
It's all right.
Sirius slurred, nuzzling into the palm still pressed to his cheek. Remus's smile widened, and he stroked Sirius's cheekbone with one long finger. Then he lowered Sirius's head to the bed again, sliding his hand out from under it carefully. Before Sirius could protest at the loss of contact, the Alpha's hands were on him, kneading at the knots in his shoulders and back. Sirius groaned contentedly as the tension left his body, and he let himself bask in the feeling of an Alpha so keen to take care of his needs.
Think you can stand up?
Remus asked after a long period of comfortable silence.
We could both do with a shower, I think.
Sirius grimaced, as the comment made him uncomfortably aware of just how gross he felt. He needed more than just a shower. His teeth felt a bit fuzzy, and he didn't even need to see his hair to know that it could definitely do with a brush. He was also pretty hungry, now that he was taking stock of things.
Shower sounds good.
He managed to croak, his mind moving slowly from the relaxation caused by the massage.
Then maybe something to eat, please.
Of course.
Remus said softly.
Anything you like, love.
He leaned forward and pressed a light kiss to the back of Sirius's neck, and the feel of those lips brushing his skin made his whole body light up, like every nerve ending was on fire. But he pushed back against it, forcing the heat down while he could as he slowly lifted himself into a sitting position. He gradually straightened up so that he was standing, and when he was sure his legs would support him, he started making his way towards the bathroom. Remus hovered around him the whole time, as though he thought that Sirius could collapse any second. Usually, Sirius hated being fussed. Whenever he was sick, he locked himself away in his flat and would only allow James or Effie to leave provisions on the doorstep for him. When he was coming out of heat, he would take care of himself, would run his own baths, and try to work the ache out of his own muscles as best he could. To his surprise, he found he was quite enjoying letting the attentive Alpha flit around him, that he liked not having to think about his needs or try to find the energy to do it, so he said nothing. He sighed when he entered the bathroom, the chill of the tiled room pleasant against his slowly heating skin. Remus closed the door, and Sirius couldn't help grinning to himself when he realized that the Alpha was in the room with him. He peeked at Remus through the mirror above the sink, while the man bustled around the room, setting fresh towels to warm on the radiator and turning the shower to a comfortable temperature. He was about to turn around, to step into the cubicle, when he saw something he recognized on the side of the sink, the travel bag of accessories that had been packed in his hold-all.
How long have you been awake?
He asked over his shoulder as he made his way over to the bag, immediately digging through it in search of his hairbrush.
Just a few minutes before you. Thought you might like to use your own things for the shower. For comfort, you know.
Remus was clearly aiming for casual, but Sirius still heard the tension under the words. He decided to wait, to give Remus time to work through whatever he needed to say. He was looking for his shampoo when Remus murmured,
I hope you don't mind that I went through your belongings. I wasn't snooping, I swear.
There it was. Sirius let out the breath that he didn't realize he'd been holding, and turned to Remus.
You're all right. Nothing in there that I wouldn't be comfortable with you seeing anyway.
The smile the Alpha gave him was a little tight, and Sirius frowned. Not quite all of it, then. He pushed.
Come on, out with it.
Your bag smells like another man.
Remus blurted, then averted his eyes and grimaced as he picked at a loose thread on one of the towels over the radiator.
I mean, it's clearly yours. It has your scent all over it. But there are things in there that smell like another alpha.
Ah,
Sirius relaxed again, unable to help the smile that spread across his face. He'd forgotten that he'd grabbed one of James's hoodies on his way out of the flat, stuffing it into his bag in case he got cold. He couldn't exactly wear his leather jacket around someone else's house, and he didn't own many jumpers of his own. But of course, the smell of another alpha among Sirius's things would be hard for Remus to understand. He carefully put his brush and shampoo down on the sink and padded over to where Remus still stood by the radiator, looking a little lost.
I'm sorry.
The alpha murmured, his cheeks flushing as he watched Sirius approach.
I know it's none of my business, of course, but I don't know. It made me realize that I didn't even know your situation before I announced that I think we're mates and…
Remus.
Sirius soothed, reaching up to cup the alpha's face in his hands. Remus looked at him through lowered lashes, and gods, if that wasn't very distracting. But Sirius made himself say calmly,
The alpha you could smell is James. He's my brother.
Remus tilted his head to one side, clearly confused, and Sirius hurriedly corrected.
Adopted brother, essentially. It's a long and confusing story, which I swear I will explain to you at some point. But for now, I can promise that you have absolutely nothing to worry about. I'm not attached to anyone.
But how is that possible?
Remus asked, his voice heavy with doubt. Sirius raised a questioning eyebrow, and Remus lifted one hand to gesture vaguely at Sirius.
Just look at you. Surely you're beating back suitors right and left?
It was Sirius's turn to blush, but he powered through it and stretched up onto his tiptoes to press his lips to Remus's. Remus sighed and sank into the kiss, the tension rapidly leaving his shoulders as he pulled Sirius's naked body against his. When he needed to breathe, the Omega broke away and said firmly,
There is nobody else. I won't lie and say I've not had offers in the past, but I really haven't ever wanted anyone. Not until now.
Oh.
Remus blinked down at him, seemingly stunned, and Sirius chuckled as he dropped his hands from the alpha's face and twined the fingers of one hand through Remus's. He tugged gently, and Remus followed him as Sirius directed them both to the shower, pausing on the way to pick up Sirius's toiletries. When he'd shut the shower door behind them, he looked up to find the alpha still gazing at him with that same besotted expression.
You'll be catching flies like that.
Sirius teased, and Remus's mouth, which had been slightly open, clicked shut. Sirius saw the man's Adam's apple bob as he swallowed, and he found it quite hard to drag his eyes away from the alpha's neck. But he made himself do it, made himself set his hairbrush on the windowsill inside the shower cubicle as he flicked open the top of his shampoo bottle. Remus's hand was already half raised, but he hesitated, blushing again when Sirius met his gaze.
Can I help?
Of course.
Sirius said, his throat suddenly quite tight. He concentrated on taking Remus's hand in his, turning it palm up and pouring some of his favorite shampoo into it. It was an expensive shampoo, and he always used too much of it, but he was proud of his hair, and he reasoned that his best feature deserved the best care. When he thought he'd poured out enough, he set the bottle down and picked up his brush, then turned his back on Remus, murmuring,
It'll be quite badly tangled, so I find it best to run my fingers through from the bottom and…
I know.
Remus interjected, and Sirius felt long fingers gently gliding through the ends of his hair, hardly pulling at all. Before the jealousy and suspicion about where he'd learned to do that could even flare in his system, Remus clarified.
My mum was sick a lot when I was a kid. I used to help her when she was too ill to do this for herself.
Sirius didn't really know what to say to that, found that he couldn't come up with a comment suitable to fit what Remus had just shared, so he just stood still and let Remus work. It took no time at all for the alpha's hands to reach his scalp, and when they got there, Remus's thumbs and fingers began to rub wonderful circles into the muscles around the base of his skull and eased the tension that he didn't even know he had around his temples.
Give me your brush, love.
Remus prompted, his breath tickling Sirius's ear, and Sirius hurriedly opened his eyes, unsure when exactly he'd let them close. He passed the brush back over his shoulder, and with just as much care as when he'd shampooed, Remus ran it through his hair, slowly and softly. It sent tingles down Sirius's spine, stirred that familiar sensation in his lower back. He bit into his lip as Remus pressed a kiss to his shoulder, carefully avoiding any shampoo on his skin, then reached over to set the brush down on the windowsill and murmured,
Rinse.
Sirius obediently turned and stepped back into the stream of water, his head tipping to let the shampoo run from his hair. When he thought it was all gone, he straightened and wiped the water from his eyes, and his breath hitched when he found Remus staring at him with an entirely different expression on his face. Before, his face had been soft, his eyes gentle. This time, his expression was sharp, ready. This time, he looked like he wanted to eat Sirius. And he didn't know how it happened, but all at once, Sirius was out from under the water and on his knees in front of his alpha. The cool, hard tile dug into his skin, but he paid it no mind as he reached for Remus's cock, already standing up hard against his abdomen and leaking profusely. Remus hissed as Sirius's fingers wrapped around his length, and the Omega had enough of himself still about him to grin up at the alpha and purr.
All this, just from taking care of me. Do you enjoy it that much?
I'd do it every day if that's what you wanted.
Remus breathed, and there was such sincerity in his tone that Sirius melted. Oh, that was what he wanted. All right. But because saying so felt too difficult, he instead surged forwards and wrapped his lips around Remus's tip, his eyes still locked on the alpha's face. Remus grunted, his teeth sinking into his scarred lower lip as his hips bucked slightly. Sirius whined and opened his jaw wider, letting Remus's shaft slide over his tongue and into his throat. Remus's eyes darkened, and he reached down to gather all of Sirius's hair into one fist, which he held behind the Omega's head. But he didn't thrust. He didn't use the grip to direct Sirius. He was simply holding his hair back for him, and it was almost too much. Sirius was instantly pressing forwards, his free hand rising to wrap around Remus's hip, to give himself something to hold on to. Heat was climbing through him again as he pushed himself as far along his alpha's cock as he could get. And what he couldn't take in, he wrapped his hand around and squeezed as he swallowed.
Fuck.
Remus groaned from above him, and Sirius would have grinned if his mouth wasn't occupied. He set up a good pace, allowing himself time to breathe each time he retreated, and trying to get closer to his own fist when he returned. He felt slick run down the insides of his thighs when Remus's knot began to form under his fingers. He was making his alpha knot, and he wasn't even inside him. He could make his alpha knot just with his mouth and his hands. He was being so good, such a good Omega. Remus suddenly pulled at the hair in his fist, and the motion dragged Sirius back and off his cock. The Omega whined, fighting to get back to his task, wanting to please his alpha, but then Remus gripped his own length, and Sirius stilled. His head was tilted back, and he looked up to find Remus staring down at him, panting hard, his amber eyes flashing.
Such a good boy.
Remus growled, and a thrill ran right through Sirius at the depth his voice had taken on. Remus's fist began to move, stroking himself firmly, and Sirius let his mouth fall open. Remus's hand tightened around his hair as the alpha rumbled.
Had to stop you, sweetheart. You were getting a little carried away. Bet you'd have let me knot that pretty little mouth, wouldn't you?
Sirius nodded, his tongue lolling out slightly as he gazed up at Remus, and Remus chuckled.
Can't be having that, though, can we? Wouldn't want you stuck like that for hours. Not when I have so many other things I want to do to you.
Please.
Sirius whispered, his vision going hazy at the promise in Remus's words.
Please what?
Remus crooned, tipping his head to the side again as he smirked and twisted his fingers over his own tip.
Tell me what you want, Sirius. Beg for it, while you're down on your knees for me.
Sirius blushed, the humiliation of the demand striking some chord deep within him, but he found himself saying,
Please come, Alpha. I want to taste you. Want you to cover me in your cum, please.
Remus snarled at the words and increased the pace of his tugging, his eyes fixed on Sirius's. Sirius tried to focus on his alpha's face, but he couldn't ignore the pull to watch as Remus's knot grew under the man's large hand. He managed to look up again when Remus rasped.
See what you do to me. You're not even touching me, and I'm knotting up just from looking at you.
Sirius's eyelids fluttered as lust flooded him, then Remus was panting.
Fuck, I'm gonna... Jesus, open your mouth, Omega.
Sirius complied, then moaned when Remus gasped, and the first rope of his release striped the Omega's face. He could taste it on his tongue, and the urge to lap it up was hard to ignore, but he made himself wait. Remus continued to stroke himself, groaning and jerking as he painted Sirius's face and chest with his spend. Sirius's mouth filled quickly, some of the alpha's cum trickling over his lips due to the sheer volume of it. And when Remus finally stopped, when his hand dropped away, Sirius reached up and wrapped one hand around his alpha's straining knot as he closed his mouth and swallowed.
You're going to be the death of me.
Remus rasped, his eyelids drooping as he gazed down at Sirius.
I hope not.
Sirius teased, but he could hear the tension in his own words. Remus must have heard it too, because he was instantly moving. He leaned down and gripped Sirius's forearms, pulling him to his feet before turning him to face the wall, pressing his face and chest to the tile. It was cool against his overheated body and felt so good. But then Remus stepped in close, pulling Sirius's hips back and nudging his legs apart with one knee, and the meaning of good was completely rewritten in Sirius's mind. The feel of the alpha's long, lean body pressing him into the wall. That was good, Sirius whined.
Please, I need.
I know what you need, Omega.
Remus rumbled, and a hand snaked down Sirius's back to his cleft. Remus wasted no time sliding 2 fingers into the Omega, grunting in satisfaction when they slipped in easily. Sirius mewled, his heart pounding in his chest as Remus's other hand on his hip kept him still, while the man slowly added a 3rd finger and fucked the digits into him.
More.
Sirius whimpered, trying in vain to rock back to sink further onto Remus's fingers, but he was no match for the alpha's strength, and Remus chuckled at his attempt.
Poor thing, still feeling empty. I can fix that.
He cooed, his breath tickling the wet skin at the back of Sirius's neck. His back arched, his mind going blank, as Remus carefully added a 4th finger and inched them into Sirius. Sirius's breath caught when Remus's knuckles met his rim, and Remus murmured into his ear.
Breathe, sweetheart. Let me give you what you need.
So full.
Sirius slurred, trying to keep a handle on the heat flooding through him. It was no use. It was burning him up inside. His voice sounded far away when he said,
So good, please, Alpha.
Remus immediately crowded against him, sliding his hand under Sirius's jaw and tilting his head up so that he could capture Sirius's lips with his. The kiss was deep and passionate, all tongues and teeth and panting breaths, and Sirius felt something in him soothe, even as Remus dragged his hand back, then eased forward at an agonizing pace. He kept it up for some time, until Sirius was almost sobbing into his mouth, and only then did he start moving quickly, steadily. Sirius was making all sorts of noises that he never knew he could make as he was stretched open, and just as he reached the top of the height, Remus curled his fingers.
God's Remus.
Sirius's cry bounced back off the tiles around them, but he was so focused on the orgasm tearing through him that he hardly noticed. It felt like it went on for far too long, mostly due to Remus refusing to let up until Sirius's legs were shaking. Then he withdrew his fingers, and Sirius watched through lowered eyelids as the alpha reached back and rinsed his arm under the shower. He saw tracks of his own slick running down the alpha's forearm before the water washed them away. Then Remus was back, holding and petting him and bringing him down slowly.
All right.
Remus murmured, nipping at Sirius's lower lip as he rubbed soothing circles along his back.
Yeah, just.
Sirius shifted, trying to ease the discomfort in his lower back. The heat had subsided substantially with his orgasm, but he could still feel it, knew that without Remus's knot, it was likely to flare again soon. Remus seemed to read his thoughts, and he gently guided Sirius away from the wall and pulled him into another deep kiss.
I promise I'll knot you again.
Remus breathed as his kisses turned light, as he peppered them over Sirius's lips and cheeks and jaw.
As soon as you've eaten something, I'll knot you again. How does that sound?
I suppose that's acceptable.
Sirius sighed, his mind still a little fuzzy, as Remus placed kisses under his jaw behind his ear.
But we'd better get on with it.
He could already feel it building. He nearly cried out as Remus backed away, but the man twined their hands together and pulled Sirius along with him until they were both under the spray of water.
Best get you cleaned up then.
Remus murmured, reaching for a bottle of soap. Chapter 5, The Mating. Half an hour later, Sirius was clean and mostly dry and leaning in the doorway of Remus's kitchen, arms folded over his chest as he watched the taller man flit and fumble about the space. Sirius had returned to the spare room for the first time since he'd dropped his belongings off there on his arrival, and had dug out a pair of joggers, a band t-shirt, and a thick hairband, which he'd used to secure his damp, shoulder-length hair to the back of his head in a lazy bun. Remus had swallowed thickly when he'd appeared, his eyes raking slowly over Sirius's body, and he'd been quick to return to his task of making sandwiches, clearly trying to stick to his plan of feeding Sirius before anything further happened. Sirius would have found this amusing if he wasn't also struggling to keep himself on track. Remus's curls were still a little weighed down with water from the shower, making them darker and shiny, and they hung in the Alpha's eyes in a way that made Sirius itch to brush them back. He'd also pulled on a somewhat threadbare knit jumper and a pair of tight blue jeans, and the overall comfortable, no-nonsense effect was absolutely killing Sirius. He was just fighting down the urge to wrap his arms around Remus's waist and scrub his face against the worn wool stretched over the man's back, when the kettle on the wooden counter clicked over, signaling that it had just boiled.
I'll get it,
he blurted as Remus half-turned towards it, grateful for something to do to distract himself. The corner of Remus's mouth flicked upwards as he nodded, and went back to buttering what looked to be a third of a loaf that he'd spread out on the glass chopping board in front of him. Sirius dug through the cupboards above the kettle until he had everything he needed, and set about making hot drinks for them both. He found the process relaxing, found it gave him something to focus on, and slowed his mind, and when he finally turned to carry the mugs to the kitchen table, he found Remus facing him, plates in hand. They smiled at each other a little sheepishly as they moved to sit down at the large wooden table that had been pushed against one wall. The kitchen was cozy, like the rest of the house, but had more of a rustic feel to it, with waxed wood and red brick tiles being the main decorative choices. There was very little clutter on the counters, and Sirius had just turned to joke about the cleanliness of the room when his eyes caught on his plate. He almost missed it when Remus inquired,
What is it?
You made me jam sandwiches.
Sirius asked, somewhat breathlessly. Remus paused and also looked down at the plate, his brow furrowed in confusion.
Apparently I did.
He said bemusedly, almost to himself. Then he looked up at Sirius again and murmured,
Is that all right? I've made myself cheese and pickle if you'd prefer that.
Yes, no,
Sirius cleared his throat, trying to catch his racing thoughts so that he could put words to the tangle in his mind.
Sorry, they're my favorite. I only usually get them when I go home. Effie always makes them for me.
Sirius considered the sandwiches again, then added slowly,
But I haven't told you about that, have I?
No.
Remus said quietly. He looked at the mugs that Sirius had placed between them, then to the station by the kettle where the Omega had left everything out, and his eyebrows rose.
And I'm pretty sure that I never told you that I take my tea with just a splash of milk and a teaspoon of honey. But it looks like you've made it just that way anyway.
Sirius blinked and looked at the mugs. He'd made himself his customary black coffee, and the other mug did indeed hold a rather dark tea. Sirius could just make out a sticky-looking amber droplet on the rim of the cup. He thought back over making the drinks and realized that he'd done all of it on pure autopilot, that he hadn't even considered asking Remus how he took his tea.
Weird,
he muttered, but Remus just chuckled. Sirius raised an eyebrow, silently inviting him to share whatever it was that he found so amusing.
I've read that this can happen,
the Alpha explained as he picked up his mug and held it nestled between his lovely, clever hands. It shouldn't be possible to be jealous of a piece of crockery, and yet here Sirius was. He made himself focus as Remus went on.
Sometimes mated pairs will become so in tune with each other that they just react on instinct. I've heard stories of pregnant Omegas developing strange cravings only to come home and find that their alpha has been out and brought home that exact thing with no understanding of why they've done it and with no communication at all.
Pregnant,
Sirius murmured weakly, his head going a little light at the implication. Remus's eyes widened as he caught the train of thought, and his hand shot across the table to grip Sirius's, grounding him.
That's not the only occasion.
Remus clarified hurriedly, rubbing a thumb soothingly over Sirius's knuckles.
Just the most recent I've heard of is all. It's a well-documented phenomena that alphas and omegas can predict each other's needs and desires. But
Remus chewed on his lip, frowned down at the tea thoughtfully.
I've only ever heard of it happening between pairs that have a long history together.
Sirius smiled at him, even if the expression was a little weak, his mind still reeling slightly.
Well, I've always been one for breaking tradition.
Remus looked at him thoughtfully then, his eyes searching Sirius's face, and the attention was just intense enough to make Sirius shift in his seat. The Alpha registered the discomfort, and with a last squeeze of his fingers, he dropped Sirius's hand and instead picked up a sandwich. They ate in silence, Remus seemingly lost in thought, and Sirius enjoying the quiet sounds of nature that he could hear outside the cottage window. He was so entranced that he forgot to be aware of his heat, and by the time he remembered, he could already feel it rising. The flare-up wasn't nearly as painful or rapid as it had been the last time it had returned, and Sirius sighed softly as he recognized the signs. This would probably be the last one for this heat. Usually by this point, he was exhausted and wrung out, conscious enough to know that he just needed to get through one more cycle, and then it would all be over again for another 3 months. This time, Sirius felt a strange contentment and an even stranger longing. He'd been rather enjoying the feeling of Remus needing him. He began to wonder how things would be tomorrow when their hormones fully receded and they were just them. Fingertips brushed lightly along his temple, and he sighed again, his eyelids fluttering as the contact made something tug behind his navel. When he met Remus's gaze, he found that the alpha was standing over him, smiling softly. Sirius frowned when he realized that the table was now clear, their dishes stacked next to the sink, his coffee likely stone cold. Remus's voice was fond as he murmured,
You really disappeared on me there.
Sorry.
Sirius huffed, his face heating. He hated when he did that, hated that Remus had seen it. He so often fought against the urge to slip into his own mind that he only ever really did it when he was alone or around someone he was entirely comfortable with. And though it didn't seem like Remus was mocking him, Sirius couldn't bring himself to look at the alpha as he rose from his chair. Embarrassment pushed him to step away, trying to get around the man's lanky frame, and to try and steer the conversation away from his slip-up, he started.
Are you ready to?
He made it all of 3 steps before long, scarred fingers closed around his wrist and pulled him back. He stumbled, and Remus caught him effortlessly, both hands gripping his waist as he steadied the Omega. But he didn't stop there. Remus used his hold to lift Sirius, who involuntarily let out a very undignified squawk. Remus was smirking when he deposited Sirius onto the tabletop, and the Omega's breath hitched when the Alpha calmly stepped in between his knees and placed those damned hands on the table on either side of his hips. Sirius was forced to spread his thighs apart and lean back in order to accommodate the taller man's frame. He opened his mouth to make a half-hearted protest about being manhandled when he realized that Remus wasn't looking at him. Well, not into his eyes, at least. That burning amber gaze was locked onto Sirius's face, on an area just to the right of his mouth. Remus was no longer smiling, his face having gone still with almost predatory intent. Without breaking his stare, Remus rasped,
You've got some jam on you.
I do.
Sirius asked, his voice annoyingly high-pitched, his heart racing inside his chest as Remus leaned in closer, his gaze still fixed on Sirius's mouth. The Alpha hummed, lifting one steady hand to point.
Right there.
Sirius started to reach up with shaky fingers to wipe at his face, but froze when Remus dipped right in and ran his tongue against the corner of Sirius's mouth. The noise that escaped Sirius was broken, needy, but then the Alpha was pulling back sharply, his eyebrows drawn together and his lips pulling away from clenched teeth as he stared into Sirius's face. Understanding that something had changed, Sirius stilled instinctively, his breathing quick and shallow.
Remus.
He whispered, trying not to make any unexpected movements, as the Alpha seemed to grow in front of his eyes.
Are you?
You smell like that other Alpha.
Remus growled, his long fingers plucking at Sirius's top. Sirius could have slapped himself on the forehead for being so stupid. Of course the shirt would smell like James. It had been tangled around the hoodie in his bag. He'd had to physically pull the items apart, for fuck's sake. He should have thought about what that would have done to the shirt. Remus's voice was impossibly tight as he demanded.
Take it off, now.
Sirius instantly stripped the garment up and over his head, throwing it as far from them as he could across the room so that it would hopefully get the scent away. Remus was instantly back, sniffing his hairline along his jaw. The Omega in him wanted to lie back on the table, wanted to let his Alpha search his whole body, if that was what he needed. He just about managed to resist, but Remus still didn't look happy when he leaned away again.
Not enough.
Remus grunted, his pupils blown wide as he bared his teeth further.
Still smell like him. Need you to smell like me. Like you're mine.
I am yours.
Sirius asserted. Some part of his mind registered with mild surprise that it had been far too easy to say those words, but he knew deep down that it was true. Something had shifted in him, probably from the moment he'd laid eyes on this Alpha, and all he wanted was to belong to Remus, and for Remus to belong to him. He ran a soothing hand up the side of the Alpha's neck as he confirmed.
Only yours, Remus. There's no one else.
Can't.
Remus was panting through his teeth as he shook his head hard, as though he was trying to clear it, but he was still frowning when he looked at Sirius again. At some point, he'd moved his hands to grasp the edges of the table, and the wood underneath Sirius creaked ominously as the Alpha's grip tightened. Remus sounded almost desperate as he ground out.
Can't get too much. I need...
Tell me what you need.
Sirius encouraged, scooting forward on the table so that his thighs spread wider around the Alpha's waist. The scent of his building arousal filled the space around them, and Remus began to rumble, low and constant, from somewhere deep inside his chest. Sirius cupped the man's clenched jaw and said again,
Tell me what you need, Remus.
Remus took a deep inhale, and his brow finally eased, the creases still present but less pronounced as he murmured.
I need you.
Then take me,
Sirius said firmly.
Do whatever you need to do to remind yourself that I'm yours.
Mine.
Remus whispered, the word heavy between them in the brief second before he pitched forward and crushed his mouth to Sirius's. The Omega sighed contentedly as the Alpha's tongue slipped into his mouth and wound his arms around the man's neck, pulling him in closer. He gasped when Remus slid his hands under Sirius's arse and lifted him, making Sirius wrap his legs around the Alpha's narrow waist. Then Remus was turning and Sirius groaned as his back hit a wall.
Gods!
Sirius hissed into Remus's mouth as he was shifted so that the Alpha could balance him on his thighs. Sirius broke the kiss when the evidence of Remus's arousal brushed against his own through his joggers, his head falling back against the wall with a thump, as Remus's hand snaked between them and tugged at the waistband of Sirius's joggers until his cock sprang free, hard and pulsing between them. Sirius whined when those clever fingers wrapped around his aching shaft, and Remus was instantly stroking him, his movements long and languid, designed to push Sirius to the edge as quickly as possible. He wanted to protest, wanted to be full when he came, but Remus was looking at him very intently, and he had the overwhelming desire to just let his Alpha take. Remus hummed in approval as Sirius went pliant against him.
At least once for me.
The Alpha purred, his eyes molten, his lower lip slightly swollen from where Sirius had caught it with his teeth.
At least once, right here, my Omega.
Sirius whined and tried to reach between them, wanting to give Remus the same pleasure, but a sharp look from Remus ended his efforts as the man rumbled.
No, just you, just for me.
Remus.
Sirius panted, rolling his hips up against the Alpha's fist. The smile Remus gave him was near feral.
Love how you say my name.
He crooned, his eyes locking onto Sirius's mouth once more.
You say it like you enjoy the taste of it.
You taste divine.
Sirius managed to pant, but his vision was blurring, his body tingling with the rapidly approaching release, and he didn't even want to consider what kind of mess his joggers were in. Remus's nostrils flared as more slick ebbed from him, and his stroking sped up. Sirius cried out at the near impossible pace the Alpha set up, his mind whirling with desire and heat and Remus. Everywhere. His scent, his hands, his impossibly handsome face. It was all he knew, only Remus.
Say it when you come for me.
Remus demanded, twisting his fingers over Sirius's leaking head, and Sirius was in no position to deny him.
Say your Alpha's name as you come.
Oh, fuck, Remus.
Sirius wailed, the word dragging out and hitching slightly as he fell over the edge, his head tipped back and his hands and thighs gripping onto Remus's body as he shook.
That's it.
The Alpha praised, his voice low and rasping as he pulled Sirius through his orgasm.
That's it, sweetheart. Don't want you forgetting who makes you feel this way, now do we?
Sirius moaned as the wave of ecstasy finally subsided, leaving behind the dull ache of the unsatisfied heat, and he was trembling as he let his head fall forward onto Remus's shoulder. The Alpha held him, his hand going to Sirius's hair, twining it through his fingers and tugging softly, keeping Sirius present. After a while, Sirius was able to pull back enough to find the Alpha ready for him, a small, pleased smile on his face as he lapped Sirius's cum from his fingers, making Sirius's hardly softened cock leap up between them in response. And although he would have liked to stay here and perhaps test the stability of the table, although he found the idea of their combined fluids soaking into the wood of the countertop and leaving a constant reminder behind of what they'd done thrilling, he also knew that this was likely to be the last round of this shared rut and heat. And for that, he wanted them to be comfortable, wanted to be somewhere that he could relax and enjoy being full of Remus for as long as possible afterwards. So he made himself straighten, made himself guide the Alpha back.
Take me to our nest, Remus.
He prompted, and the Alpha nodded, his eyes fixing on the pulsing point in the dip between Sirius's shoulder blade and his throat. He peeled Sirius off the wall and carried him through to the bedroom, his pace steady, but hurried. as though he didn't want to wait, and Sirius was glad for it. He was already tearing at the man's worn jumper before Remus even got them across the threshold. The Alpha groaned when the Omega ran his tongue up his neck in one long, hot stripe.
You make me feel insane.
He rumbled, the words breathless as Sirius sucked a dark bruise right over his pulse point.
That's just the rut talking.
Sirius mumbled absent-mindedly into the skin of Remus's throat, but then he was being pulled away by a hand lightly gripping the back of his neck. He went still when Remus met his gaze.
It's all you.
The Alpha growled, his eyes darkening rapidly as he stared at Sirius.
You're fucking intoxicating, love. I've been wild from the second I first caught your scent.
Oh,
Sirius said quietly, the heat flooding through him at the intensity of that look. But then Remus was dropping to his knees, right in the middle of the nest that Sirius had built for them, and his scarred face softened as he took a long, slow inhale. Sirius couldn't help grinning as he asked,
better.
Gods, yes.
Remus sighed as he buried his nose into the crook of Sirius's neck. He took another slow breath in and huffed into Sirius's shoulder.
Can only smell us now.
It's a good smell.
Sirius murmured, transfixed by the sensation of Remus's teeth scraping along his collarbone.
The best.
Remus agreed, his lips buzzing against Sirius's chest as he trailed kisses over his sternum. Sirius leaned back, using his grip on Remus's shoulders to slowly lower himself, his back arching when his shoulder blades finally touched material. Remus growled, his eyes sparking as he gazed down at Sirius, laid out over his thighs and across the floor of the nest. His palms were soft as they skimmed over Sirius's pale torso, and Sirius's eyelids fluttered at the tender touch. There was evident need in Remus's voice as he murmured,
So beautiful. If I went blind right now, and this was the last thing I'd seen, I wouldn't even be upset.
Sirius couldn't help preening at the praise, but it was Remus's tongue scraping around his navel that made his back arch harder, made him push as much of his body upwards as he could, letting Remus taste him. The Alpha slowly shuffled backwards as he nipped and lapped at every inch of skin that he could reach, and it took Sirius a moment to realize that his joggers were being taken down too. His shaft pulsed, ready and eager, when Remus finally freed him of the soaked trousers.
Wish I could keep you like this forever.
Remus said, his eyes scanning Sirius from head to toe, his fingers and thumbs kneading higher and higher up the toned flesh of Sirius's thighs.
My own personal feast.
Alpha.
Sirius whispered, his vision blurring slightly as lust coursed through him at the words, the tone. Remus's eyes were sharp when he glanced up at Sirius, and the absolute devotion on his handsome face made Sirius melt. He stretched his body under Remus's touch, rolled his hips, enticing, inviting.
Please need you. Need my Alpha.
Oh, you'll get what you need, Omega. Don't you worry about that.
Remus was breathing hard, his eyes darkening again as he watched Sirius move. Then he sat back on his heels, making quick work of tugging his jumper up and over his head, then wrestling out of his jeans. Sirius whimpered when Remus's thick shaft was bared, spreading his legs wantonly. Remus grinned down at him as he crawled back up Sirius's body.
So keen for me, sweetheart. Such a good boy. Bet your gorgeous body's all ready for me. I can smell how wet you are. Bet you don't really need much preparation at all.
Let's find out.
Sirius murmured, and before Remus could react, he hooked one leg around the back of the Alpha's waist and dug his heel into the man's pert arse. Remus grunted as the motion pushed him forward, but the noise turned into something else entirely as he sank into Sirius with surprising ease. It still burned a little, and Sirius had to take a moment to blink back a tear, but then Remus was gliding, the slick around his rim easing any friction. They both moaned when Remus bottomed out.
Greedy.
Remus finally rasped, nipping lightly at Sirius's ear in reprimand.
You were taking too long.
Sirius panted, twining his fingers into Remus's curls as warmth spread through his body, from his toes all the way up to the roots of his hair.
Gonna have to do something about that attitude, little Omega.
Remus chuckled, drawing back to stare down at Sirius with one eyebrow raised. Sirius opened his mouth to make some scathing retort, but it died on his tongue when Remus snapped his hips forward, driving impossibly deeper into Sirius. There was heavy amusement lacing the Alpha's words as he added,
At least I know I can make you good and quiet when you're drunk on my cock.
Sirius could only whimper as Remus set up a punishing pace, rocking into him hard and fast. Remus watched him intently as he fell apart under the Alpha's movements, his amber eyes glowing with pride and desire as Sirius rolled his hips up to meet every thrust. But although it felt just as good as every time they'd been together so far, Sirius had the feeling that something was missing. He wanted something, needed something, so badly that it was making his jaw ache. Without thinking, he leaned up and sank his teeth into Remus's neck. Remus gasped, his hips jerking and driving him deeper still into Sirius, and Sirius whined as he licked over the already bruising skin on Remus's throat before he picked another spot and bit again. It eased the tension in his jaw, but now there was a dull ache at the base of his own throat, and suddenly, Sirius knew exactly what he needed to ease it.
Bite me,
He said, leaning back to stare up at the alpha, and Remus's eyes went almost entirely black as their gazes locked. Remus sucked in a ragged breath, all traces of amusement gone from his face as he surveyed Sirius.
I can't.
The alpha snarled, even as his eyes trailed down over Sirius's neck and came to rest at the base of his throat, right where Sirius needed him. It made Sirius grip his shoulders, made him lock his ankles tighter at the base of Remus's back.
You can. I'm giving you permission. I'm asking you to do it.
Don't. I can't.
Remus breathed, his voice almost pleading. But Sirius had heard his reservations, had heard his concerns, and though he understood them, he was present enough to decide that they didn't matter. He wanted this. He needed this.
Please,
He begged, ducking his head to catch Remus's gaze again, trying to convey everything through his eyes.
I'm telling you that you can have me. I want you to do it. I need you to claim me. Remus, please.
Sirius broke off with a harsh gasp as Remus pitched forward and sank sharp teeth into his neck. He felt something tear, felt a thick fluid spill over his collarbone, but seconds later Sirius was filled with the most delicious ecstasy he had ever experienced. It was so pure, so all-encompassing, that it was almost too much for him to contain, almost too painful. He felt like he was floating, suspended in mid-air as warm, white light flooded his body. But then he was coming, sobbing through his orgasm with Remus's teeth still in his throat, the alpha groaning around his flesh as he in turn spilled deep inside of Sirius. His knot expanded rapidly, and Sirius cried harder as pleasure and pain blended perfectly and left him feeling torn apart and entirely wrung out. And still Remus thrust into him, chasing that unfathomable high, filling him with what felt like impossible amounts of his seed, and Sirius could only gasp through his tears as the man's motions prolonged the most profound orgasm he'd ever experienced. Sirius had no idea how long it took for Remus to stop, but even when his hips finally came to a halt, the alpha was far from still. He was immediately lapping at Sirius's wounded neck with his tongue, soothing the deep bite as best he could, before moving away to drop light kisses over every inch of Sirius's pale flesh that he could reach while trapped in this position. He was whispering something over and over against Sirius's overheated skin, and it took a few minutes for the ringing in Sirius's ears to recede enough that he understood what the alpha was saying.
I'm sorry, I'm so sorry.
Sirius lifted shaking hands and placed them on either side of the alpha's beautiful face, and he pushed, gently easing the man back. His heart skipped when he found that tears were running steadily down over his high cheekbones, dripping from his strong jaw. The man's lower lip trembled as he gazed sadly down at Sirius, and he whispered again.
I'm so sorry, Sirius.
Why are you saying that?
Sirius asked, wiping at Remus's wet cheeks, alarmed by the alpha's distress and completely at a loss for what to do.
I should have waited.
Remus said quietly.
I shouldn't have. I lost my head. I let my stupid fucking instincts and jealousy take over. I should have waited until you could consent. Or until your next heat. And...
But I gave you my consent.
The worry was instantly replaced by something stronger, an overriding need to show this alpha that he hadn't just made some stupid, heat-addled Omegan decision. Remus sniffed, and he still looked sad as his eyes danced over Sirius's face, seemingly trying to read him.
You weren't.
Don't think to tell me that I don't know my own mind.
Sirius growled, and Remus blinked down at him in surprise. Sirius stared right back and went on firmly.
I've had enough people in my life tell me what they think is best for me. Turns out it's me who knows what's best, and I know that I asked you to claim me.
Sirius's voice softened as he ran his thumb over the alpha's cheekbone.
I chose you, Remus.
Suddenly, something nasty and bitter coiled in his gut, and he tried not to cringe away as he pressed.
Or is it that this isn't what you wanted? Your inhibitions are just as much affected as mine are. Did you not want to claim me?
Don't ever think that.
Remus snapped, his frown instantly back in place as he lowered himself to press his body against Sirius's, aiming to comfort.
I've wanted you since the moment I saw you, Sirius. I've never had the desire to claim someone like it's been with you.
There you are then.
Sirius said triumphantly as the tension flooded out of him.
We both wanted it, and it's done.
He smiled gently as he slid his hands up to tangle in Remus's hair, and the alpha melted further into him when Sirius purred.
And now I'm officially yours.
Mine.
Remus breathed, his eyes bright and burning. Sirius tugged at the curls between his fingers, and Remus complied with the silent request, dropping his head to press his lips to Sirius's in a searing kiss. He retracted ever so slightly to murmur, almost in disbelief.
You chose to be mine.
And I'd do it again and again.
Sirius asserted, his own eyes stinging as he watched a complicated tangle of emotions flit over Remus's scarred features. He had to swallow before he could speak again.
I don't know much about mating bonds, but I do know that when I look at you, I feel so content, like I could have everything I might ever need. And this might sound strange, but it feels like I already know everything about you, like maybe we've met in another life or something. I mean, the incident with the sandwiches and the tea is just too freaky to dismiss, right?
I know what you mean.
Remus sighed, his eyes getting that faraway look that Sirius was starting to recognize as the man getting sucked into a train of thought. So he played with Remus's curls while he waited for him to come back. Eventually, Remus said,
It feels almost inevitable. You know, I feel like I already know how you'll react in every situation. Like I'm ready for you, no matter what's going on. Does that make sense?
Perfectly.
Sirius murmured, because although he couldn't explain it, it did. He could already guarantee that Remus would be soft and careful around just about anything, but that if something touched a nerve, he would retreat in on himself so far that Sirius would likely have to dig at him for days to get him to crack. He couldn't help but grin at the knowledge that their fights were going to be explosive, and that the making up afterwards would make it all entirely worth it.
Thank goodness.
Remus sighed, the corner of his mouth twitching upward.
Think I'd probably struggle to explain all of this to anyone else, mind.
You and me both, mon coeur.
The words had slipped from him before he could catch them, and he instantly stilled as his brain registered the use of his second language. He hardly spoke it anymore, not since severing ties with his family. He hardly ever had to watch himself for it these days, and yet the endearment had slipped from him with absolutely no conscious input from himself. He was almost afraid of how Remus might react, but he made himself peek up at the man hovering over him and found that Remus was gaping.
You speak French.
Remus blurted, his eyes dancing over Sirius's face, gazing at him like he was seeing the Omega for the very first time.
Yeah.
Sirius muttered, fighting the urge to shy away, to hide himself from the intensity of Remus's stare. He was about to apologize when Remus let out a soft, punched-out sound and dropped his forehead to Sirius's shoulder.
Oh, I am absolutely fucks.
The alpha groaned into his skin, and Sirius chuckled as he tightened his hold on the wonderful man in his arms. Chapter 6, The Merging. 16 hours. It had been 16 hours since they'd fallen asleep, entirely tangled together in Sirius's nest. 16 hours and Remus still hadn't woken. Sirius was scared. He'd been up for 4 hours already, had risen when the morning light had filled the bedroom, sighing contentedly when he found that they'd shifted in the night, so that Remus was plastered against his back, the warm weight of him comforting. Sirius had been careful with his movements, congratulating himself when Remus didn't so much as stir when he'd carefully extracted himself from the man's arms. Sirius had showered and changed, but when he'd returned to the bedroom, he'd found Remus in the exact position he'd left him in. Frowning, something about the situation suddenly feeling abnormal, Sirius had tried to rouse the alpha. He'd touched, then gently shaken his shoulder and received no response. He'd fought down the worry that rose in him, had told himself that Remus must have just really needed the rest. So he'd sat down at the edge of the nest, legs crossed under him, and watched, and chewed at his nails, and waited. And in the whole of the 4 hours that he'd held his vigil, Remus hadn't moved once. Until now, Sirius almost sobbed with relief when the alpha finally began to wake, groaning and stretching his body in a way that had his joints popping and clicking. He watched as Remus reached out with one heavy hand, patting the blankets next to him, searching. The alpha's eyes shot open when he found the space empty, and Sirius shakily smiled with burning eyes when that fuzzy, sleep-laden gaze landed on him and the alpha visibly relaxed.
Hi.
Remus murmured, his voice thick with sleep. But as his drowsiness began to clear, his eyebrows lowered, and he reached out and wrapped a large hand around Sirius's ankle, a comforting gesture. His nostrils flared, and he must have scented Sirius's distress because he was instantly clear-eyed, murmuring urgently.
What's wrong?
You...
Sirius swallowed, the smile sliding right off his face as his breath hitched.
I couldn't wake you.
Remus was instantly sitting up, and though he groaned at the motion, he didn't pause to fully right himself, instead reaching out and taking hold of Sirius's shoulders. He pulled, and Sirius allowed himself to be tugged forward into the Alpha's lap. Sirius couldn't hold back his sob this time, as he buried his face in the crook of Remus's neck and held on tight. In the 4 hours he'd had to himself, his mind had spiraled so deeply that he'd managed to convince himself that something awful must have happened, that Remus's delayed rut had made him ill or something that might cause the man in his arms to never wake up.
Hush, oh love, it's all right.
Remus crooned into his hair, his long arms cradling Sirius as he tried to regain control of himself.
I'm sorry I scared you. I should have told you.
At this, Sirius sat back, blinking away the last of his tears as he frowned at the Alpha in confusion. Remus grimaced, but he held Sirius's gaze as he went on.
I told you that I have a medical condition, right?
Yeah.
Sirius breathed, his mind flitting back to that very first meeting. Gods, had that only been 2 days ago.
Well,
Remus said slowly, and from the way his jaw tightened, Sirius knew that the man was preparing to tell him something painful. He gave Remus his whole attention as the Alpha explained.
I have something called lupus. It's an autoimmune condition, my body fighting itself essentially. There are lots of ways it can present. For example, I used to get all of these really painful cracks in my skin.
He glanced down at his arms, and suddenly Sirius understood.
And that's where your scarring came from.
He prompted quietly. Remus nodded.
Ever since I presented as an alpha, I don't get that particular symptom anymore. And the scars were much worse before. Something about that first surge of alpha hormones lessened a lot of the deeper ones.
Remus's face had turned sad, distant, and it made Sirius's chest ache. Carefully, he slid his hands up Remus's bare torso, making sure to touch as much of the marred skin as he could on his way, and finally bringing his hands to rest on either side of the man's neck, cupping his jaw. Remus's eyes focused again, and he gave Sirius a grateful smile.
But how does that relate to me not being able to wake you up?
Sirius asked, when he was sure that Remus was with him again.
It's another symptom.
Remus explained, his body relaxing slightly as Sirius stroked his thumbs along the Alpha's jaw.
I experienced some pain in my joints, which again got somewhat better after I'd presented. The one thing that's still just as bad is the fatigue. I'm pretty tired all of the time. I don't always sleep well though, so when I'm comfortable and able to sleep properly, I tend to just knock out for periods of time.
Remus's eyes skated over Sirius's face, as though he was searching for something as he added.
It's also why I'm better able to control my alpha impulses.
His eyes flicked down to the scar on Sirius's neck.
Well, mostly, the fatigue dulls them somewhat.
Remus trailed off, his eyes meeting Sirius's again, and the Omega was surprised to see apprehension in the Alpha's face, almost as though he expected Sirius to just get up and leave, now that he knew about this part of him. White-hot anger flared in his chest at the idea that someone might have done that previously, might have scarred Remus in a way that couldn't be seen. So Sirius made a point of settling further into the man's lap and asked,
What can I do to help?
Help.
Remus choked out, his eyes turning shiny as he blinked at Sirius. Sirius didn't look away, kept his expression resolute, and all at once Remus's face crumpled. His voice was shaking as he asked,
You mean you don't mind?
Why would I mind?
His tone was a little sharpened by the apparent confirmation of his suspicions, but he held himself steady as he pressed on.
It's just another part of you, Remus. Why would it make a difference?
Remus swallowed hard, tears lining his eyes.
It's not something that's going to get any better. I'm always going to be like this, and it may even get worse at times.
Remus sighed, his eyes dropping to Sirius's neck again, and there was clear bitterness to his tone when he muttered, as though to himself.
I should have told you all of this before.
Remus,
Sirius said softly, thumbing at the man's tanned cheeks again.
You're my alpha. I wanted you to be my alpha before I knew about your condition, and it doesn't change anything. Nothing that you could tell me about yourself will change how I feel about you.
A small broken sound escaped Remus's throat as he tipped his head forward and buried his face against Sirius's neck. Sirius could feel the man's tears running over the still sensitive skin of his new claiming mark, but he held Remus as the alpha cried, his whole body sagging with relief at Sirius's assertion that Remus having lupus changed nothing.
You're incredible. You know that, right?
Remus rasped when his tears had finally subsided and he was staring at Sirius with such tenderness that the Omega could almost feel the weight of the look against his skin.
So I've been told, but it's always nice to hear it again.
Sirius teased, leaning in to press a soft kiss to Remus's lips. The man hummed at the contact, then pulled away and wrinkled his nose.
Gods, look at you, all clean and lovely, and here I am making you all dirty again.
I like being made dirty, if it's you doing it.
Sirius purred, earning himself a deep chuckle from Remus. But the man nudged at him, a clear signal, and Sirius reluctantly climbed out of his lap.
You'll trip over that bottom lip, one of these days.
Remus cooed, but his touch was affectionate as he lifted one hand to the Omega's face and thumbed at Sirius's pout. Sirius just huffed, and Remus laughed again as he eased himself slowly to his feet. He swayed slightly, and Sirius had to resist the urge to reach out and steady the alpha. Somehow, he had the feeling that Remus would not appreciate being coddled. When he was stable, Remus smiled once more at Sirius before turning away and heading towards the bathroom. Over his shoulder, he said,
Let me just freshen up, yeah? I won't be long.
I'll go put the kettle on.
Sirius offered. Remus made an appreciative noise as the bathroom door swung shut behind him, and Sirius let his shoulders drop, the tension of the last 4 hours finally seeping out of him. Remus was all right. He was going to be all right. Sighing, Sirius headed toward the kitchen. The kettle was boiling by the time Sirius returned to the kitchen. He had his phone in his hand, which he'd realized he hadn't even touched since he'd arrived at Remus's. He had wandered into the spare room in search of it while waiting for the water to heat, and had been a little surprised to find the device turned off in the bottom of his bag. He rarely ever switched it off, but he had a clear memory of having done so before he'd chucked it in the bag on that very first day here. The device had begun its startup the moment he held down the power button, and he'd decided to take it with him, to perhaps catch up on whatever he might have missed while he made the tea. He was so intent on watching the screen come to life that he didn't notice the man sitting at the table until he cleared his throat. Sirius yelped and fumbled with the phone, then glowered at Remus, who was grinning widely at him.
Yeah, laugh it up.
Sirius grumbled, but he was fighting his own smile as he swept past Remus, pressing a kiss to the damp curls laying against the alpha's temple, and depositing his phone on the tabletop as he made his way over to the kettle.
Tea.
Please.
Remus murmured, and even now Sirius could hear the edge of the fatigue clinging to his words.
Just give me a minute, and I'll make us something to eat.
Ce n'est pas un problème, mon cœur.
Sirius replied, waving a dismissive hand at Remus as he dropped a tea bag into a mug. He set it down by the kettle with another empty one, and pulled open the cutlery drawer in front of him, searching for a spoon as he went on distractedly.
You just take it easy. I'll whip us something up. If you have any eggs, I make a mean French toast. My uncle was French, loved his cooking, taught me everything he...
Love.
The apprehension in the alpha's tone made Sirius tense, and he looked over his shoulder to find Remus eyeing his phone warily. Even from here, Sirius could see why. The screen was lit up, and rolling along it were a multitude of notifications, the list still growing. Sirius abandoned his search and strode back to the table, scooping up the device and scanning through the messages.
Oh shit.
Sirius muttered as he scrolled through missed call after missed call, all from the same number.
What is it?
Remus asked, his voice tight with concern.
You know I told you about James?
Sirius said carefully, trying to ignore the rising panic in his chest. Remus seemed to notice it anyway, as he reached out and wrapped an arm around Sirius's waist, using it to pull him closer, to stand between the alpha's legs.
The brother who's not your brother.
Remus asked, his thumb rubbing soothing circles into Sirius's hip.
That's him. Looks like he's called at least twice an hour since I've been here.
Sirius felt his own eyebrows rise as he looked back at the list.
Even through the night, stupid bugger must have been waking himself up to call.
All right.
Remus said slowly.
Well, if he's trying so hard to get in touch with you, then perhaps you should call him back.
Do you mind?
Sirius blurted, relieved despite himself. During his rut, Remus had reacted so strongly to James's scent that Sirius had wondered how the alpha might act if he were to bring him up. But the situation had forced his hand, and thankfully it seemed that Remus was a lot calmer about the situation, without pheromones clouding his judgment.
Not at all. He's your family after all.
Remus's eyes were soft, accepting, and Sirius's heart almost burst from it. He ducked to press a quick kiss to Remus's lips, then straightened, and without even thinking about leaving the room for privacy, he hit the redial button. It didn't even fully ring once.
Where are you, Pads?
James's voice was hoarse, firm, like he was struggling to hold back his anger. Remus immediately went still, his eyes zeroing in on the phone pressed to Sirius's ear. A potential threat to his mate had all signs to drowsiness instantly overridden by the need to be ready to protect. Sirius absently lifted his hand to run it through the Alpha's curls soothingly as James went on.
Those shits at the agency wouldn't give me the address of your client, and you didn't check in. What the fuck is going on?
Breathe, Jamie.
Sirius coaxed, and after a short pause he heard James take a slow, deep breath. Only when he heard the exhale did Sirius speak again.
I'm fine, I'm with someone, but the situation has changed.
He looked down at Remus, and the corners of his mouth twitched upwards when their eyes met.
It's not a work thing anymore.
What the fuck does that even mean?
James shrieked, and Sirius winced and held the phone away from his ear so that the man's incoming rant wouldn't damage his hearing. James was instantly berating him for being stupid enough to turn his phone off while in a stranger's home, for not sticking to their rule of checking in at least twice during the day, and just where the hell was he anyway? And
Prongs,
he snapped finally.
calm down. I'm here of my own choice. I'm safe.
Remus's fingers squeezed the back of his thigh at the word, and Sirius tugged gently at the Alpha's hair in recognition. Remus liked that Sirius felt safe with him. Good.
Tell me where you are.
James ground out, his jaw evidently clenched, and Sirius hesitated, in a way he never had with James Fleamont Potter. He glanced down at Remus for consent. It was his home after all, and in the millisecond it took for him to nod, James was asking fearfully.
Pats.
I'll tell you,
Sirius said, his voice laced with warning.
but only if you promise to behave when you get here. If you're still in this mood, I won't be letting you in.
Deal.
James grunted, his irritation clear in his tone. Sirius rolled his eyes but gave James the address anyway, and he listened while James tapped on his smartphone to bring up directions. His voice was a lot calmer when he came back and said,
All right, I'll be there in 4 hours. Love you.
Love you too, you stupid twat.
Sirius muttered, grinning despite himself. James barked out a laugh, then ended the call. He was still grinning when he looked down at Remus once more and found that the Alpha's tension had been replaced with mild amusement.
I think you'd better tell me the story,
He murmured, his hand firm on Sirius's thigh.
just so I know what to expect when he arrives.
Probably a good idea.
Sirius conceded, then stepped out of Remus's grasp. He would probably need something to do, he knew, to get through telling the story all in one go. Some parts of it were, well, he'd face that when they got there. As he made his way to the fridge, he began.
I think you probably got a bit of an idea about what my blood family is like by now.
From what you've told me, yes.
Remus said, his tone carefully neutral. Sirius shot him a glance, one that he hoped would let the Alpha know that he should brace himself.
They're old blood.
He hazarded, reaching into the fridge and scooping up eggs and milk, which he carried over to the stove and set down carefully. As he rifled through the cupboards, he went on.
An old family line, who married carefully and haven't developed their traditions for hundreds of years. Why break away from patterns of behavior when they work so well at instilling fear and keeping everyone in line?
Bread is in the cupboard by your knees.
Remus prompted, his voice tight. Sirius nodded and retrieved the loaf before turning away again.
We were told only certain things, that all of us were to be married into partnerships that would strengthen the power in our bloodline, that every heir to the family estate for the past 200 years has been an alpha, that omegas are weak, only good for breeding stock.
There was a cracking of wood behind him, and Sirius whipped around to see Remus releasing the edge of the table carefully. The man's jaw was set so hard that Sirius could see every muscle corded along it.
I'm sorry, I'll stop.
Tell me.
Remus growled, his eyes dark as he gazed right at Sirius. Sirius's chest tightened, but he nodded, then turned away slowly, reaching over his head for a wide, shallow pan that hung from a hook in the beam above the cooker.
When I presented as an omega, my mother refused to allow me to retain my title as heir.
He carefully skirted around the exact words that she'd used, how she'd thrown him from the house on the very cusp of his first heat. Instead, he said,
Luckily, James and I had gotten quite close over the years. He's from an old blood family too, one that is very different to mine, but we were sent to the same private school, and that's how we met.
He heard his own voice soften as he cracked the eggs into the pan.
You'll love James. Everyone does. He's just so good.
He cupped the empty shells in his palm and stepped back from the hob, sneaking a look at Remus as he made his way to the bin. Remus's eyes had lost that dangerous edge, but he was just as rapt, focused intently on the Omega's every word. Sirius washed his hands thoroughly before returning to the stove to stir some milk into the eggs.
Anyway, I went right to him when I was made unwelcome at home. He and his family accepted me without question, and I've been with them ever since.
A smile tugged at his mouth as he thought of Euphemia and Fleamont, how they'd made every effort to make him feel included, had ensured that whatever opportunities James got, Sirius was offered them too.
Monty's the coolest, so calm for an alpha. And Effie.
She makes you jam sandwiches.
Remus murmured, and when Sirius looked at him this time, he had to swallow the lump that rose in his throat at the expression on the man's face. Remus was looking at him like he knew just how much it hurt him to think about his dismissal, just how hard it had been to adjust to a new family with different ways of doing things.
Yeah.
He croaked, then cleared his throat and hurriedly dropped 4 slices of bread into the pan.
She also taught me that being an Omega is nothing to be ashamed of. But bless her, though she tried, I suppose I've just never been ready to consider much outside of what I've been told about our biologies all my life. In case you haven't noticed, I can be quite stubborn.
Who, you?
Remus teased lightly, and Sirius lazily flicked his fingers in a rude gesture over his own shoulder. Remus's resulting chuckle eased more of his discomfort about sharing his past, and he deftly flipped the slices of bread in the pan, allowing them to soak up the remaining egg mixture as he formed the last of his story in his mind.
It's always been me and James,
he mused, pressing the crisping bread against the hot surface with practiced fingers.
Even before they took me in. We were inseparable. Mum tried to ban me from spending time with him, but I threw such a fit that she had to settle for just banning him from the house.
Without looking up, he reached for a couple of plates from the cupboard beside the cooker, then jumped when his hand met skin instead of wood. He turned to find that Remus had gotten up silently and was also in the act of reaching for plates, but seemed frozen, his eyes locked on Sirius's face. Suddenly nervous, he asked,
"What?"
You talk about him with such love.
Remus said gently, and Sirius prepared himself for an onslaught of questions and jealousy. It wouldn't be the first time that his inescapable connection to James brought those things out in a potential partner, but Remus seemed almost awed as he breathed.
I'm so glad that you've had someone like that in your life, especially when you needed it most.
All at once, Remus's arms were around him, pulling him in close. Sirius melted into the Alpha's hold as Remus added,
I can't wait to meet him.
You're going to love him,
he asserted, pulling back to smile up at Remus. He lifted a hand to brush his fingers over the Alpha's cheek and added,
and he's going to love you.
They stood, smiling at each other for long moments, until the smell of burning toast forced them to spring apart. Laughing, Sirius reached to rescue the pan, and Remus hurriedly grabbed 2 plates from the cupboard for him to deposit their salvageable breakfast onto. And as Remus led him through into the living room, so that they might sit comfortably to eat, Sirius felt an excited anticipation fill him at the thought of the imminent meeting of the 2 men most important in his life. It only took James 3.5 hours to reach Remus's home, and with the way he skidded to a stop in the driveway of the cottage, Sirius knew that he must have been driving like an absolute maniac all the way. In usual circumstances, he would have bollocked James the second he stepped out of the sleek black Jaguar for being so bloody reckless. But these weren't usual circumstances. Instead, he stood in the front room, watching through the wide window as the man paused to take a look around. He watched the hazel eyes that he knew so well widen at the sheer beauty of the setting, and couldn't help the small flash of pride that filled him. It was ridiculous, of course. This was Remus's home. The cottage and the setting had absolutely nothing to do with Sirius. But he was so keen for James to like Remus, for him to see that Sirius had in fact been safe this whole time, that the knowledge that James approved of the location of the cottage went quite far in easing his apprehension. His shoulders dropped further as the man turned towards the house, and as though he'd known exactly where to look, met Sirius's gaze through the glass. His face instantly crinkled into a smile, his brown skin practically glowing in the late morning sun, adding a glow to his already dazzling grin. Sirius wanted nothing more than to go out and jump into James's strong arms, to feel that familiar comfort of home. But that wasn't how this was going to go. He and Remus had agreed that it was only fair that the Alpha was the one to greet James, that he should be the one to assess James's intentions before he permitted him to enter his home. So Sirius remained where he was and watched as James quickly approached the cottage. He tried not to be nervous. James was an alpha from an old bloodline, with very functional parents and a solid upbringing. He knew how to behave, knew that it would be rude and stupid to upset or attempt to threaten Remus in any way, but both he and Sirius had never been any good at keeping their heads when it came to ensuring each other's safety. He just hoped that James had used the drive over here to relieve some of the fear he'd heard in his voice over the phone earlier. Sirius stood in the living room, listening carefully as James rapped smartly on the front door, and Remus opened it from where he'd been waiting on the other side since James had pulled up. He strained his ears and caught the ends of a pleasant greeting and introduction, and a breath he didn't know he'd been holding whooshed out of him when he heard Remus invite James in. His alpha directed the other towards the living room, and James's feet sounded hurried as he strode down the hallway towards the door that Remus had indicated. Sirius remained frozen as the tall man rounded the doorframe, and James halted the moment their gazes met once more. Sirius watched as James's eyes flicked over his body, checking for any injuries or signs that something was wrong, and appeared more relaxed by the second when he found nothing. But then he found Sirius's neck, and his mouth tightened at the sight of the new, already healed scar in the shape of Remus's teeth. Sirius straightened, his jaw set, and he held James's gaze when the man's hazel eyes rose to meet his again. They stared at each other for some time before James finally sagged and nodded, and Sirius beamed.
Get over here, then.
He teased, opening his arms, and James surged forwards, scooping Sirius to him and holding him tight. Sirius sighed happily, the smell of his brother a welcome comfort, and he smiled when he looked over James's shoulder and found Remus watching them with evident fondness. His alpha tilted his head towards the kitchen, indicating that he was going to go and make some tea for them, and Sirius nodded slightly to show that he'd understood before turning his attention back to James.
Never again, Pads.
James croaked, his eyes slightly damp behind his glasses as he pulled back and stared at Sirius once more, as though he couldn't believe he was there.
Never do that again, okay? We always check in. Always.
No, I know.
Sirius soothed, leading James over to the sofa and gesturing for him to sit.
I'm sorry, Prongs, I really am. I've just been a bit distracted.
So I see.
James murmured, glancing pointedly at Sirius's neck again. Sirius opened his mouth to explain, but James held up a large hand, grimacing.
Please, no details. I don't think that I could stomach it.
Sirius chuckled, earning a crooked smile from the man in front of him, but then James was looking at him intently again.
Tell me you're happy. Tell me you wanted this.
I'm very happy.
Sirius assured him, his smile turning soft as he thought of the man currently making far too much noise in the kitchen in an attempt to give them some privacy.
I wanted this. I want this.
He took a deep breath, then turned to face James, looking him in the eye so that he would see the truth in what Sirius was about to say.
He's my mate.
Fuck off.
James breathed, his eyes going wide. Sirius snorted but didn't look away, and after a few seconds, James's stare turned into a gape.
You're serious, aren't you?
Sirius grinned, sucking in a breath with barely contained delight, but James beat him to it, his face turning stony and raising one finger to point at Sirius in warning.
Don't you fucking dare, you absolute menace.
Spoil sport?
Sirius grumbled, but he was still smiling as the alpha lowered his hand and shook his head, chuckling to himself.
How do you know?
James asked after a few moments of silence, and Sirius instinctively knew what it was that James was asking about.
Because I could feel it.
He said simply, shrugging.
From the moment I first saw him, I could feel something right here.
Sirius put his hand over his own sternum.
Pulling at me. It wasn't until his rut got delayed, and he put the pieces together and told me that I understood that I was being pulled to him. But from the moment I set foot in this house, Jamie, I just knew that all I wanted was him, and nothing was ever going to feel right without him again.
Sirius blinked, realizing that his eyes had strayed towards the door, towards the kitchen, and he almost reeled backwards when he looked at James once more.
Jamie, are you all right?
Under his smooth, dark skin, James' face had gone very pale, and his black brows were pulled so high up his forehead that they disappeared behind the mass of unruly hair that always managed to flop over his forehead. He was gripping his own knees hard enough that his knuckles had gone white, and Sirius could see the muscles in his throat standing out in cords, and his voice was stretched far too thin when he managed to mutter back.
Yeah, no, I'm fine,
Then he was standing, his eyes darting around the room, his hand already going for his pocket.
I brought you a suitcase with some bits. I'll just, go and get it.
He was out of the door before Sirius could say another word. The front door clicked shut a few seconds later. Entirely baffled, Sirius strode across the living room and peered through the window, his frown deepening as he watched James stop on his way towards his car to pull his phone from his back pocket before hurriedly dialing a number. After a few seconds, he began gesticulating wildly as he held an animated conversation with whoever was on the other end of the line. Sirius couldn't hear what the man was saying, but he recognized the body language well enough. Sirius sighed, knowing from experience that whenever James was this excited about something, he either needed to fully talk through whatever was going on with whoever it involved, or take himself away entirely until he'd calmed down enough to discuss the main points rationally. Sirius also knew that he would just have to wait to see which one it would be today. And while he waited, he decided that he might as well make himself useful. So he strolled down the narrow hallway, stopping outside the kitchen door and grinning as he asked,
Need some help?
Remus's head lifted from where he'd been hunched over the teapot, pouring what appeared to be a freshly boiled kettle into it. The soft smile that tugged at Remus's lips made Sirius's heart skitter, and he was moving across the tiled floor before he could even tell his feet to move. He had fully intended to help, but suddenly found himself mesmerized by the way Remus moved. His long body was almost graceful as he reached up into the cupboard and pulled down mugs, tea bags, and honey, and his slender fingers were incredibly distracting as they deftly pulled apart the perforations in the tea bags before dropping each one into the hot water.
That was impressive.
Remus suddenly murmured as he stirred the pot, and Sirius made himself look up at his alpha, one black eyebrow raised in question. Remus went on.
You just went toe-to-toe with an alpha, had a silent 10-second argument with him, and apparently won.
Remus smirked and turned to press a kiss against Sirius's exposed neck.
If you weren't already mine, I might be a little jealous.
I can argue with you, if you'd like.
Sirius replied sweetly, then gasped when Remus nipped gently at his throat before pulling away.
You can try, love, but I can promise you that I'll win.
The taller man said simply as he turned back to put the lid on the teapot, and Sirius tried to ignore how the quiet confidence in Remus's tone made his knees go weak. He was half tempted to just start an argument right here and now, to see what might happen if he pushed Remus to put him in his place. But then Remus asked,
Why does he call you Pads?
It's a shortened version of my nickname.
Sirius confessed, grimacing. He'd hoped that would be enough, but Remus cocked his head to the side expectantly, and Sirius sighed.
It's short for Padfoot. He started calling me that when I moved in with them, because he says I pad around like a dog that's up to mischief and is trying not to be noticed.
Remus said thoughtfully. Sirius looked at him pointedly, and Remus shrugged.
He's not wrong.
Sirius scowled, irritated, and Remus hurriedly went on.
Why do you call him Prongs?
Because when he had his first crush, he would go completely still, like a deer in headlights, every time he saw her.
Sirius chuckled at the memory of the slack-jawed look James used to get every time the Evans girl had walked by them in school, wholly ignoring him.
He was obsessed, right until we found out that she presented as an alpha. Broke his little heart, that did.
Poor lad.
Remus murmured, his voice genuinely sympathetic, and Sirius's heart leapt again at the man's innate tenderness.
He's all right.
Sirius reassured him, slipping his arms around Remus's waist and tugging the alpha into a hug. Remus dropped the kiss on top of his head as he pulled Sirius in close, and Sirius scrubbed his face into Remus's chest, breathing in his sweet, heady smell before sighing.
But I do hope that he finds what we've found one day.
Everyone deserves to be loved.
Remus said softly, and Sirius tilted his head back and accepted the deep, lingering kiss that Remus placed on his lips. Yes, everyone did deserve to be loved, especially this wonderful, brilliant man in Sirius's arms. And as they parted to carry the tea into the living room, Sirius promised to himself that he was going to spend every day of the rest of his life showing Remus Lupin just how much he deserved to be loved. Finite. Thanks for listening to this text-to-speech podfic composed by Burning Aurora, Kaliana, and Flowerhawk.